There is a machine out there that has ended more raider runs than almost any other single threat in the Ark invasion. And today, we are going to go deep on every piece of lore we have about it, what it is, where it came from, and why it behaves the way it does. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. All right, so I want to quickly explain why I made this video and the choices I made when putting it together. I've been sitting on a pile of notes about the Leaper for a while now. There is a lot of fragmented information scattered across the game in loading screen text, environmental details, survivor logs, and the way the machine itself behaves in the world. And I wanted to pull all of that into one place and try to make sense of it. The thing is, a lot of what we know about the Ark machines is interpretive. The game does not hand you a clean explanation. So in this video, I made the choice to lead with the Leaper's behavior and design first, before getting into the bigger picture of what it represents in the Ark hierarchy. I felt that grounding it in what players have actually seen and experienced first would make the broader lore hit harder. I also excluded some speculation that felt too thin to hold up, and I will point out where I am doing that as we go. This is my reading of the lore, not the definitive version. With that said, let us get into it. Chapter 1. The Worlds That Broke and the Machines That Fell. To understand the Leaper, you have to understand the world it arrived into. Ark Raiders takes place in a future where Earth has been largely emptied of its former population, driven underground by relentless waves of machines that descended from orbit. These are not machines in the science fiction tradition of robots rebelling against their creators or pursuing some human-like goal of conquest. The Ark, as they are called, operate according to a logic that is alien to human thinking, and that strangeness is part of what makes them so terrifying. They do not negotiate, they do not rest, they do not pursue survivors out of spite or hatred. They simply do what they do, and what they do is kill anything that moves on the surface. The world they occupy now is one of ruined infrastructure, abandoned outposts, collapsed supply chains, and desperate communities huddled in underground shelters called havens. The surface belongs to the Ark, and the Leaper is one of the creatures that enforces that ownership. The exact timeline of the Ark invasion is something that the game suggests rather than states outright. What we can piece together from various in-game sources is that the machines came in waves, each wave more sophisticated and better suited to the environment than the last. The first machines were brutal and effective, but somewhat predictable. Later machines showed signs of adaptation, as if the Ark was learning from its own encounters with human resistance and adjusting its designs accordingly. Whether that adaptation is biological, computational, or something else entirely, is one of the central mysteries of the lore. The Leaper sits somewhere in this developmental timeline, and pinpointing where is not straightforward. What we can say is that the Leaper does not look or behave like a first-generation Ark unit. Its design suggests refinement, a machine that was built knowing what it would face. The surface world that the Leaper patrols is not simply abandoned. It is a strange kind of occupied territory, where the ruins of human civilization still stand in various states of decay, and Ark machines move through those ruins as if they own them, which they effectively do. Loading screens and environmental text in Ark Raiders suggest that some areas of the surface retain strategic value, not just for human raiders looking to extract resources, but also for the Ark itself. Certain zones appear to be more heavily patrolled than others, with denser concentrations of machines guarding specific structures, caches or locations that seem to matter to Ark operational logic. The Leaper is consistently found in these kinds of areas. That is not a coincidence, and the lore gives us some clues about why. Raiders, the player characters in Ark Raiders, are survivors trained to descend to the surface in teams, extract valuable resources, and return to their havens alive. The job is extraordinarily dangerous, not just because of the machines, but because of other raiders competing for the same resources, hostile environmental conditions, and the sheer unpredictability of what you might find on any given run. The Leaper has become a central fixture in raider culture, not just as a threat, but as a kind of benchmark. Experienced raiders measure runs partly by whether they encountered a Leaper and how they handled it. There is a grim respect attached to the machine. the kind of respect you develop for something that has killed people you knew. Most of what we know about individual Ark machines comes from this Raider perspective. The Ark does not leave manuals behind. It does not communicate its intentions. Everything we understand about a machine like the Leaper has been assembled from Raider reports, technical analyses done with limited tools underground, and the painful education that comes from direct encounters. This means the lore is always filtered through a human lens, which is worth keeping in mind. When a survivor describes the Leaper as aggressive or territorial, they are projecting human concepts onto a machine that may not have anything like those qualities internally. But those projections are what we have to work with, and they tell us a lot about both the machine and the people who fear it. One of the first things Raiders noticed about the Leaper is its movement. Most Ark machines in the game move in ways that feel mechanical, predictable to some degree, like they are following programmed patrol routes with limited variation. The Leaper does not feel that way. It moves with something that observers consistently describe as purpose, as if it is actively scanning its environment and making decisions in real time about where to go and what to do. Whether this is genuine processing intelligence or a very sophisticated patrol algorithm is something the lore does not definitively answer, but the effect is the same. When you see a Leaper in the distance, you cannot assume you know where it will be in 30 seconds. That uncertainty is built into how it operates. The four-legged design of the Leaper is something that Ark Raiders lore touches on in ways that suggest it was not arrived at randomly. Quadrupedal movement offers stability across varied terrain, the ability to change direction quickly without losing momentum, and a lower center of gravity that makes certain defensive responses more effective. On the broken, debris-strewn surfaces that make up most of the game's playable areas, a four-legged machine has significant advantages over bipedal designs. It can cross rubble fields, navigate collapsed roadways, and handle sudden drops in terrain without the kind of stumbling that would leave it vulnerable. The Leaper's design, in other words, seems optimized for the exact environment it operates in, which again suggests that it was built or adapted with knowledge of that environment. There is a reading of the Ark invasion that suggests the machines are not simply attacking Earth, but processing it. Under this interpretation, the Ark is not an army but something closer to a harvesting apparatus, collecting materials, data, or energy from the planet for purposes that humans cannot fully understand. The presence of heavily guarded objectives on the surface would fit this model. The Ark is not protecting these areas out of militaristic strategy, so much as it is guarding sites of operational importance. A Leaper standing between a Raider and a valuable cache might be doing something closer to what a security system does than what a soldier does. This distinction matters because it changes how we interpret the Leaper's behavior. It is not trying to win a war. It is executing a function. The lore around Ark Raiders is deliberately sparse in some places and surprisingly detailed in others. Developer notes and in-game text suggest that the team behind the game wanted to preserve mystery around the Ark's actual nature and goals, while giving players enough context to feel like they were operating in a coherent world. The Leaper benefits from this approach because it allows the machine to feel genuinely alien without requiring an explanation that might undercut the fear. We know what it does. We have strong guesses about why it does it, but the complete picture remains just out of reach, and that gap is where most of the interesting lore lives. Early Raider reports about the Leaper, referenced obliquely in some of the game's text elements, describe a machine that initially seemed less dangerous than it turned out to be. There are suggestions that early encounter data led some Raiders to underestimate it, to treat it more like a patrol drone than a genuine combat threat. That assessment changed quickly and permanently. The Leaper's ability to close distance is something that almost cannot be conveyed without experiencing it directly, and by the time Raiders understood the machine's full range, they had paid for that understanding in lives. The name Leaper itself is interesting from a lore perspective. It is a Raider designation, not an Ark designation. The Ark does not name its machines, at least not in any way that humans have been able to decipher. Raiders named this one for the most immediately obvious and dangerous thing it does, which is exactly how human beings under extreme stress tend to categorize threats. You focus on what can kill you most directly. The Leap can kill you most directly, so it became the Leaper. This naming convention is present throughout Ark Raiders lore, and tells us as much about raider psychology as it does about the machines themselves. Humans in this world are not in the business of nuanced taxonomies. They are in the business of survival. The Leaper's relationship to the other Ark machines it is often found alongside is something that the lore hints at in interesting ways. It is frequently observed in proximity to smaller, faster units, often described as scouts or skirmishers in Raider field notes. The combination of these unit types creates a tactical situation that is significantly harder to manage than either type alone. The smaller units can close gaps, harass and create distraction while the Leaper positions itself for its devastating attacks. Whether this is coordinated behavior in any meaningful sense, or simply the result of both unit types being assigned to the same high-value patrol zone, is a question the lore leaves open. The effect on raiders is the same either way, which is that you are never dealing with just a Leaper when you find a Leaper. What the surface actually looks like in Ark Raiders is worth spending some time on, because it is the canvas on which the Leaper operates. The game depicts a world that has been through multiple stages of abandonment and decay. Buildings still stand but are gutted. Roads exist but are cracked and overgrown. Industrial infrastructure sits rusted and silent. The sky is frequently obscured. Scavenger plants and other post-collapse flora have started to reclaim certain areas. Through all of this, Ark machines move with a kind of eerie regularity, their patrol patterns imposed over a landscape that was built for something completely different. The Leaper in this environment looks genuinely wrong in a way that makes the horror work. It is not built for what this world used to be. It is built for what it has become. One of the more striking details in the environmental lore is the way certain areas show signs of Ark activity that goes beyond simple patrol. There are zones where the terrain itself appears to have been modified, not dramatically, but in ways that suggest the machines have been doing something other than wandering. Cleared sightlines, repositioned debris, paths through rubble that seem too consistent to be accidental. Whether the Leaper is involved in any of this environmental manipulation is not confirmed, but its presence in these modified zones is consistent enough to be notable. The lore suggests, without stating directly, that the Ark machines are doing something in these areas that matters to Ark operational goals, and the Leaper is there to make sure that activity is not interrupted. Raiders who have survived multiple encounters with the Leaper describe a learning curve that is steep and unforgiving. The first encounter is typically shock and loss. Somebody dies, or the whole team barely gets out, or they simply ran and counted themselves lucky. The second and third encounters build on that foundation of near trauma and start to reveal patterns. The Leaper's patrol routes, while less predictable than simpler machines, are not completely random. There are tendencies, preferred positions, behaviors that repeat. Experienced raiders learn to read these tendencies the way you learn to read weather signs, not with certainty, but with enough probability to make better decisions. The machine is still dangerous. It is always dangerous, but it becomes a known danger rather than an unknown one, and that shift represents real survival value. The shockwave pulse that the Leaper deploys is one of the most distinctive elements of its combat profile. Unlike ranged weapons that require line of sight and aim, the pulse affects everything in a radius around the machine simultaneously. It cannot be dodged by ducking behind cover that is too close. It punishes raiders who approach thinking that proximity to the machine is inherently safer than distance. In a game where raiders are often trying to minimize their profile and avoid detection, the pulse is a brutally effective counter to the instinct to get close and go quiet. It is as if the machine was designed specifically to punish the approaches that raiders would most naturally take against other threats. That design logic, whether intentional on the Ark's part or not, makes the Leaper feel like something that has been calibrated to deal with humans specifically. The question of whether Ark machines, like the Leaper, are calibrated to deal with humans specifically is one that runs through a lot of the game's deeper lore. On one hand, the machines arrived and immediately began killing humans, which suggests they were prepared for that. On the other hand, the Ark's behavior suggests goals that extend beyond simply eliminating the human population. If the Ark just wanted humans dead, it could presumably accomplish that more efficiently than it has. The presence of machines like the Leaper guarding specific objectives rather than simply hunting survivors wherever they hide suggests that human elimination is a secondary concern to whatever the Ark is actually doing on the surface. Raiders are a threat to be managed, not a target to be pursued. The Leaper is part of that management system. This interpretation, that the Ark sees raiders as an operational disruption rather than a primary target, actually fits the Leaper's behavior very well. The machine does not chase raiders indefinitely. It has zones, it has patrol ranges. When raiders exit its area of concern, it typically returns to its route rather than following them into the unknown. This is consistent with a machine that is fulfilling a security function rather than a hunting function. The Leaper is protecting something. What exactly it is protecting varies by location, but the principle seems consistent across encounters. Understanding this about the Leaper changes how you interact with it. You are not fighting a predator. You are trying to get past a guard, and guards have rules, even if those rules are enforced with lethal force. The lore around the Leaper's origins within the Ark machine hierarchy is fragmentary. We do not have a clean origin story. What we have are implications. The machine's sophistication suggests it is not an early Ark design. The precision of its combat capabilities suggests it was built for a specific purpose in a specific context. Some in-game text points toward the idea that the Ark produces different machine types for different phases or aspects of its operation on a given planet, and that the Leaper belongs to a security and enforcement tier rather than a scouting or harvesting tier. If that reading is correct, then the Leaper's presence in an area is itself a piece of information. It tells you that the Ark has judged that area important enough to assign high-level security to it. There is something almost architectural about the way the Leaper is deployed. Raiders who study patrol patterns over time notice that Leapers are not scattered randomly across the map. They occupy nodes, key points in the network of Ark activity, junctions where patrol routes converge, approaches to high-value structures, corridors that cannot be easily bypassed. This is not proof of genuine strategic intelligence, but it suggests that whatever system determines Ark deployment is operating with spatial logic that is not entirely unlike military-based planning. The Leaper is where it needs to be to maximize its effectiveness as a deterrent. It is, in a sense, placed. And that placement is very often exactly where raiders need to go. The psychological impact of the Leaper on raider communities is something the lore addresses in small but meaningful ways. There are references to specific Leaper encounters that became legendary in Haven culture, stories that circulated through the underground communities not just as tactical information, but as narrative. The Leaper appears in warning tales told to new raiders. It appears in the informal slang that raider teams develop around their most dangerous experiences. It has become a cultural touchstone for a particular kind of fear, the fear of a threat you cannot outrun, cannot hide from easily, and cannot take lightly regardless of your experience level. In a world where almost everything can kill you, the Leaper has earned a special place in the hierarchy of things people are genuinely afraid of. The final point worth making in this opening chapter is about what the Leaper represents in the broader context of the Ark invasion. If we accept the interpretation that the Ark is a system designed to do something to Earth, rather than simply destroy it, then every Ark machine is a tool in service of that system. The Leaper is a security tool. Its job is to prevent interference with Ark operations. In that reading, the fear it inspires in raiders is a feature, not a byproduct. A machine that raiders learn to avoid is a machine that is doing its job extremely well. The Leaper does not need to kill every raider it encounters. It just needs to make raiders think twice about going where the Ark does not want them to go. And it does that with a level of effectiveness that even experienced raiders who have learned to work around it still feel in their gut every time they see one in the distance. There are other Ark machines that are deadlier in direct confrontation. There are others that are more numerous. But the Leaper occupies a unique space in the lore because of what it represents. A machine that combines genuine physical threat with behavioral sophistication in a way that forces raiders to change how they approach entire areas. That influence over raider decision-making is the Leaper's real power, and the lore, fragmented as it is, keeps returning to that theme in different ways. This machine matters, not just because it can kill you, but because it changes everything around the encounter even before the encounter begins. The shape of the Leaper's operational territory varies somewhat by location, but certain patterns hold across the law. It tends to claim relatively open areas, spaces where its leap can be fully utilized, where the ground is firm enough to support its weight when it lands, and where its shockwave pulse cannot be easily negated by terrain. Raiders have noted that encountering a leaper in very tight urban spaces is rarer than encountering it in open industrial zones, cleared fields near structures, or wide corridors between major ruins. This preference for open ground is not just tactical, it tells us something about what the leaper was designed to do. It was designed for wide area denial. It is not a room-clearing machine. It is a perimeter machine, something that controls the space around a location rather than the location itself. The relationship between the leaper's preferred terrain and the layout of high-value objectives in Arc Raiders is one of those details that rewards careful attention. The areas where you most need to go as a raider tend to have open approaches. That is partly a function of map design, but it also reflects a real-world logic about where valuable infrastructure tends to be located. In clearings, near transport routes, in accessible zones, the leaper's natural hunting ground and the raider's natural target zone overlap almost perfectly. Whether the Ark planned this, or whether it simply resulted from both systems being optimized for the same environment, is one of those questions the law deliberately leaves unanswered. The practical result is the same. Where you need to go, the leaper waits. In Haven communities, certain individuals have built reputations around leaper knowledge. These are not necessarily the best fighters. They are the people who have studied the machine the most carefully, who can predict its patrol timing with reasonable accuracy, who know the telltale signs that a leaper is nearby before it comes into view. These individuals are valued for exactly the reason you would expect. In a world where information is survival, knowing the leaper's patterns is currency. The law references these figures in passing, in the kind of offhand detail that the game uses to build its world without stopping to explain it. A name mentioned in a survivor log, a reference to someone who knows the big ones in raider slang. These fragments point toward a whole culture of leaper study that exists underground and that informs how the surface runs are organized. The tension between the tactical necessity of engaging leaper zones and the overwhelming instinct to avoid them is a recurring theme in the lore. Raiders who specialize in high-value targets have to develop a specific relationship with their own fear of the leaper. The reward structures in Arc Raiders reflect this. The most valuable resources tend to be in areas where leapers patrol. The game communicates through its design what the lore communicates through text and implication. If you want the best outcomes, you have to go where the most dangerous things are. The leaper is the price of admission to the parts of the surface that still hold real value. And deciding whether to pay that price is one of the central calculations of every serious run. This chapter has been about context, about placing the leaper in its world and starting to understand what that world tells us about the machine. In the chapters that follow, we are going to get much more specific. We will look at the physical design of the leaper in detail, at its two signature combat behaviors, at its relationship with other Arc units, at the tactical responses Raiders have developed over time, and at what all of it might tell us about the Arc's larger agenda. The leaper is not just a dangerous enemy, it is a piece of evidence. And if you read it right, it tells you something about the whole system it belongs to. Let us get into it. Chapter 2. Built to break you. The physical design of the leaper. The physical appearance of the leaper is the first thing Raiders report on, and consistently, the descriptions carry a kind of reluctant fascination. It is large, not incomprehensibly large, not the sort of machine that you cannot imagine moving quickly, but large enough that when you first see it, there is a moment of recalibration, a reassessment of everything you thought you knew about what you were walking into. Its four legs are not arranged in a simple rectangular pattern, like a table. They are articulated in a way that gives them enormous range of motion, able to brace for impact, extend for distance, or absorb landing shock depending on what the machine is doing. Raiders who have had close encounters and survived describe the legs as the most unsettling part, not the obvious weapon systems, but the legs tell you what this machine was made for before it does a single other thing. The chassis of the leaper sits low and compact relative to its leg span. This is not a machine with a tall center of gravity. It is built closer to the ground than you might expect given its size, and that geometry makes a certain kind of physical sense when you understand what the machine does. A lower center of gravity helps with stability during the leap, and more importantly, during the landing. When a leaper comes down after covering 30, 40, 50 meters of open ground in a single bound, it needs to land without tipping, without losing its combat effectiveness, without giving its target time to react. The chassis design facilitates exactly that. It lands, absorbs, and responds, all in a sequence that happens faster than most radars can process in real time. The material composition of the leaper's body is something that the law addresses indirectly, mostly through the practical reality of what weapons do and do not work against it. Arc machines in general are built from materials that are not entirely consistent with what humans know about metallurgy and materials science. Raiders have noted that certain approaches to arc machine armor seem to work differently than expected, that some materials appear to deflect or absorb damage in ways that suggest they are not passive structures but active systems. Whether the Leaper has any of this active defensive capability in its hull is not clearly established in the law, but the fact that taking one down requires meaningful effort and specific approaches suggests that its construction is not ordinary. There is something in the in-game text that points toward the Ark manufacturing its machines with a degree of environmental specificity that goes beyond what a generic military machine would require. The implication is that Ark machines are not produced in a one-size-fits-all process, but that the Ark's production logic accounts for the specific conditions on the world being operated on. If this reading is correct, then the Leaper was not just designed for a quadrupedal function in abstract. It was designed for Earth specifically, for the terrain conditions, the gravity, the atmospheric pressure, the kinds of obstacles it would encounter. Its legs are tuned for Earth's gravity. Its leap calculations account for Earth's environment. It is not a generic Ark machine deployed to a generic world. It is a product of Ark intelligence applied to a specific set of parameters, and those parameters happen to be the ones that humans have to survive in. The head unit of the Leaper, the forward-facing section that houses what raiders assume to be its primary sensory apparatus, is distinctive enough that it has appeared in raider shorthand and in formal description across multiple lore fragments. It does not have a face in any human sense, but it has a forward orientation, a directional clarity that raiders have learned to respect, because when the front of a Leaper is pointed at you, you are inside its primary attention zone. Exactly what sensors the Leaper uses to detect targets is not fully specified in the lore. Visual input seems likely, but there are accounts of Leapers detecting raiders who are not visible, suggesting thermal, acoustic, or some other detection modality that humans do not have a clean analogy for. The implication from these accounts is that hiding from a Leaper in its active zone is significantly harder than hiding from most other Ark machines. The legs of the Leaper are worth spending more time on because they are the most mechanically complex part of the design and carry the most implications for how the machine operates. Each leg has multiple articulation points, far more than a simple four-limbed frame would need for basic locomotion. This complexity gives the legs their extraordinary range of function. They can extend to their maximum reach for a leap. They can compress to absorb landing impact. They can brace in a stance that lowers the machine's profile before a pulse discharge, presumably to manage the recoil or energy dynamics of that system. Raiders who have observed the Leaper at rest, if rest is even the right word for a machine that seems perpetually active, note that the legs are never completely still. They make small adjustments continuously, like a system that is always maintaining readiness, rather than ever truly powering down. The leap itself is obviously the behavior that defines the machine and gives it its name, but the physical mechanics of how the leap works are worth understanding in detail because they explain why it is as effective as it is. The Leaper does not simply jump. It loads its legs in a very specific way before launching, a slight crouch, and repositioning that raiders have learned to read as a pre-leap tell. The problem is that this tell is extremely brief. The window between recognizing the loaded stance and responding appropriately is measured in fractions of a second for a raider at distance. For a raider at medium or close range, there is essentially no window at all. By the time the machine is in the air, your options have already been significantly reduced. The leap arc itself is not perfectly vertical. It is a calculated trajectory that leads the machine to where you are or where it predicts you will be, not where you were when it launched. That predictive element of the leap is one of the more disturbing details in the law. Raiders report that leaping directly sideways at the moment of launch does not reliably result in the leaper missing. The machine seems to account for basic evasion, at least simple lateral movement. Whether this is genuine target prediction, reactive flight course adjustment, or something more like a wide area leap designed to create impact across a radius rather than strike a precise point, is debated in the raider community law. The most experienced raiders tend toward the middle interpretation, that the leaper is not omniscient in its prediction, but that it accounts for the most common evasive responses, because those responses were apparently common enough to be worth accounting for in its design. This is another detail that suggests the machine was built with specific knowledge of how humans respond to threats. The landing from a full leaper leap is itself a combat event, not just a movement. The impact of a machine of that weight and velocity striking the ground creates a localized shockwave that can destabilize raiders who are too close to the landing point. This is distinct from the directed pulse that the leaper can deploy as a deliberate attack. The landing shockwave is a byproduct of the physics involved, not a weapon system, but it functions as one in practice. Raiders caught within a certain radius of a landing leaper may find themselves staggered or thrown, leaving them briefly unable to respond to the follow-up attack that typically comes immediately after the machine regains its footing. The sequence of leap, land, recover, attack is fast enough and damaging enough that it functions as a complete kill sequence against isolated targets. The size relationship between the leaper and the smaller arc units it is commonly found alongside is not incidental. The visual contrast between a large, heavy quadruped and the quick, smaller units reinforces the layered threat dynamic that makes leaper encounters so difficult. When you are managing incoming fire from multiple small, fast units, the leaper can position itself and charge its leap without you having the focus to respond appropriately. When you shift focus to the leaper, the smaller units are free to advance or flank. This is why raider doctrine around leaper encounters consistently emphasizes that you cannot address one threat type without having a plan for the other. The combination is not accidental, whether it results from deliberate arc tactical coordination or simply from both unit types being assigned to the same zone, the effect is the same. And it is effective. The leaper's torso or central body section houses what raiders have tentatively identified as the power source or energy management system for the pulse attack. Exactly how this system works is beyond the technical knowledge available to most raiders. What they observe is the effect. The pulse discharges in a radial pattern from the machine's central body, affecting everything within its radius, regardless of angle or cover. Some in-game text suggests that the pulse is an electromagnetic or kinetic energy discharge, rather than a conventional explosive, which would explain why certain types of cover are less effective against it than raiders initially expect. A wall between you and the leaper may protect you from a bullet. It may not protect you from a pulse that propagates through or around physical structures. The maintenance and self-repair capability of ARC machines is a topic that the law touches on in a way that is relevant to the leaper specifically. There are references in survivor accounts to machines that were clearly damaged in previous encounters, showing signs of impact or weapon effects that continued operating at high effectiveness. The implication is that ARC machines have some degree of damage tolerance or even repair capability that exceeds what human engineering would produce. Whether the leaper specifically demonstrates this is not fully confirmed, but raiders report that disabling, rather than destroying a leaper, in a single combat encounter is much more difficult than you might expect. The machine absorbs punishment and keeps going in a way that suggests its systems are designed with redundancy and fault tolerance in mind. The visual signature of the leaper in the field is distinctive enough that experienced raiders can identify one at considerable distance, well before it is close enough to present an immediate threat. Gait is the primary tell. The way it moves is different from other ARC machines in a way that, once learned, is unmistakable. The leg cadence, the way the torso stays level while the legs handle the variation in terrain, the specific rhythm of its patrol movement, these are all recognizable. New raiders often mistake a distant leaper for a different machine type until they get close enough to see the details, a mistake that has cost many of them their run. The experienced raider maxim about the leaper, echoed in multiple lore fragments, is essentially learn to see it at distance, because the alternative is learning about it up close. and that is a lesson with a very low survival rate. The pulse attack's visual and auditory signature before it discharges is something that radar lore has documented carefully, because this information is tactically critical. There is apparently a brief period before a pulse discharge during which the leaper's central body produces a specific visual effect, likely a buildup of the energy being discharged. Raiders who know what to look for can sometimes identify this pre-pulse state and react accordingly, creating distance, getting behind significant cover, or disrupting the discharge sequence through damage. The problem is that the window is short. Conditions on the surface often degrade visibility, and by the time you are close enough to clearly see the pre-discharge signature, you may already be within the effective radius. The lore is realistic about this. Knowing the tell helps. It does not save you automatically. There is an interesting detail in some of the environmental lore about what happens to the ground around areas where leapers patrol over extended periods. The terrain shows specific kinds of wear patterns, impact marks from repeated landings, surface scarring consistent with pulse discharge. These marks are a kind of secondary lore, a record of the machine's activity written into the landscape itself. Raiders who learn to read terrain for these signs can sometimes identify a leaper's regular patrol route and preferred jump-off points before they even see the machine. This is the kind of field knowledge that does not get taught in any formal setting. It gets passed between raiders who have spent enough time on the surface to start seeing the world the way the machines have shaped it. The leaper's posture when it is not in active combat mode is something that the lore describes in a way that is almost eerie. It does not go dormant in the way that some ARC machines appear to enter lower activity states. It maintains its patrol behavior continuously, the legs always moving, the head unit always scanning. But there is a quality to this continuous activity that raiders describe as patient. They are quick to acknowledge that patience is a human concept and probably not what is actually happening. What they mean when they use that word is that the leaper does not seem agitated. It does not seem frustrated. It is simply doing what it does, indefinitely, without any apparent need for the kind of rest or relief that makes human guards predictable over time. A human guard gets bored. A human guard gets tired. A leaper does not. And that absence of human weakness makes it a qualitatively different kind of threat. The question of whether the leaper has any form of memory or learning capability is one that the lore raises without answering cleanly. Some raider accounts suggest that a leaper that was engaged but not killed in a previous encounter seems to behave differently in subsequent encounters in the same area. Whether this is genuine learning, some form of state memory, or simply confirmation bias from raiders who are now watching the machine differently after a previous bad experience is impossible to say with certainty. The lore treats this ambiguity with appropriate restraint. It does not claim that the leaper learns. It documents the observations that suggest it might. That distinction is important, and it is part of what makes the leaper feel genuinely mysterious rather than simply dangerous. The sound design of the leaper is not something that lore typically addresses directly, but several survivor accounts describe the acoustic experience of a leaper encounter in enough detail that it functions as lore. The footfall of the machine in motion is distinctive, a rhythm of impacts that experienced raiders can identify through ambient noise. The pulse discharge has an acoustic component that survivors describe in visceral terms. The leap itself, while primarily visual, has an associated sound that raiders who have heard it once rarely forget. These acoustic details are part of how the leaper occupies mental space in raider culture. It is not just something you see, it is something you hear coming. And by the time you hear it, your options have already changed. The weight distribution of the leaper during different phases of movement tells us something interesting about how its systems are prioritized. During a leap, the energy distribution is obviously directed toward the legs, maximizing extension and force. During a pulse discharge, survivors report that the machine takes a braced stance, distributing its weight low and even across all four legs, which suggests that the pulse system generates significant forces that need to be managed mechanically. This moment of bracing is the pulse tell that experienced raiders learn to read. The machine changes its stance before it fires, and that stance change, brief as it is the only warning you get. Understanding that the bracing is a pre-attack posture rather than just a random behavior shift is one of the critical pieces of leaper knowledge that separates raiders who survive repeated encounters from those who do not. The Leaper's operational range, meaning the territory it covers in a standard patrol cycle, is larger than most other Arc machine types of comparable size. This means that knowing a Leaper is in a general area does not give you the kind of positional certainty you might have with a slower, more localized machine. The Leaper can be covering ground that you would not expect it to reach, appearing at the edge of a zone you thought was clear, doubling back on a route in a way that cuts off a path you were planning to use. This extended operational range is a function of its mobility, obviously, but it is also a function of its role. A security machine that can cover more ground per unit time provides more security value than one that covers less. The Arc, or whatever system the Arc uses to assign machines to roles, appears to understand this on some level. The Leaper's patrol range is not incidental to its design, it is part of its function. The relationship between the Leaper's physical capabilities and the terrain of the areas it most commonly guards reveals a design logic that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Open ground, wide sightlines, clear jumping distances. These are the environmental features that make the Leaper maximally effective, and these are exactly the environmental features of the locations it most commonly occupies. Either the Arc deployed the Leaper specifically to terrain it would dominate, or the zones that the Arc values most happen to be zones that a machine like the Leaper is best suited to defend, or both. All three of these interpretations point toward the same conclusion. The Leaper and its environment are matched in a way that suggests more than accident. The machine fits its world too well for that fit to be random. The final physical element worth examining in this chapter is the Leaper's apparent damage response behavior. When it takes significant damage, it does not flee or attempt to withdraw to a safer position. It does not have a visible retreat protocol. Instead, its behavior escalates. It becomes more aggressive, more active, more likely to use its leap and pulse in close succession rather than separately. This escalating aggression pattern under damage is a design choice that makes a certain kind of brutal sense for a security machine. A retreat response would allow raiders to wear it down safely from range. An escalation response punishes the attempts to do exactly that. Raiders who have tried to chip away at a Leaper from a distance report that the machine closes rapidly under sustained fire, forcing the ranged engagement into a close-quarters encounter that plays entirely to the Leaper's strengths. All of this physical design, the legs, the leap, the pulse, the chassis geometry, the escalating combat response, tells a coherent story about what this machine was made to be. It was made to be impossible to ignore and impossible to engage on your terms. Every physical characteristic of the Leaper serves one of two functions. Either it makes the machine harder to kill, or it makes the raiders' preferred methods of dealing with threats less effective. There is a clarity to the design that is almost admirable in a grim way. Whoever or whatever designed the Leaper understood what they were designing it against. And in a world where raiders are the primary surface-level threat to Arc operations, that means the Leaper was, on some level, designed with raiders in mind. Chapter 3. The Shockwave Pulse. How the Leaper controls space. The Shockwave Pulse is not the Leaper's most visually spectacular attack. The leap covers more distance, creates more visual drama, and lands with more obvious physical impact. But in terms of pure tactical significance, the pulse is arguably the more important of the two signature behaviors. Understanding why requires understanding what the pulse actually does to the way raiders have to position and move in the Leaper's presence, which is something quite different from simply dealing damage in an area. The pulse changes the geometry of engagement. It makes approaches that would be reasonable against other machines actively dangerous. It creates a zone of consequence around the Leaper that raiders have to account for at all times, not just when the attack is active. That zone, and the way it forces movement patterns, is where the pulse's real tactical impact lives. The mechanics of the pulse, as best as raiders and in-game lore have been able to reconstruct them, involve the discharge of energy from the Leaper's central body outward in all directions simultaneously. The radius of this discharge is not fixed in any strict sense. Lore fragments suggest that it varies somewhat based on the machine's state, with a fully charged pulse extending further than one discharged while the machine is still building to full power. This variability is tactically significant because it means raiders cannot simply maintain a fixed safe distance and expect to be protected. The edge of the danger zone shifts, and knowing how charged the machine is at any given moment requires either very close observation or a lot of painful empirical testing. Neither is a comfortable option. The physical effect of the pulse on raiders who are caught in it varies with distance from the leaper at the moment of discharge. Raiders at the outer edge of the radius report primarily being thrown or staggered, an effect severe enough to disrupt aimed fire and movement, but not necessarily immediately lethal. Raiders at the inner range of the pulse radius report something considerably worse: concussive effects, potential equipment damage, and the kind of physical impact that can be lethal or near lethal depending on the raider's condition and loadout. This graduated effect zone is another element that makes the pulse design sophisticated. It is not a binary hit or miss. It is a damage gradient that creates different strategic implications at different distances, all of which the raider has to account for simultaneously. The directional properties of the pulse, or rather the absence of them, are central to why this attack is so difficult to counter. Most powerful attacks in any combat system have a direction. They come from somewhere and go somewhere. Effective defense usually involves getting out of that line. The pulse does not work this way. It radiates outward from the leaper's position in all directions equally, which means there is no angle from which you are safe simply by virtue of your angular position relative to the machine. The only geometric factor that matters is distance, and as we have already noted, that distance is not fixed. Raiders who have tried to use cover between themselves and the leaper before a pulse discharge report that the cover does not consistently protect them, which suggests the pulse propagates either through or around physical barriers to some extent. The relationship between the pulse and the leaper's other attack, the leap, is where the real tactical genius of the machine's design emerges. The leap closes distance. The pulse punishes proximity. These two systems complement each other in a way that creates a no-win geometry for raiders who do not have a very specific plan. If you hold your distance, the leaper can close it with a leap, putting you inside pulse range. If you try to maintain safe separation after a leap, the leaper can discharge the pulse at the moment when you are closest, maximizing its effect. The sequence of leap followed immediately by pulse is one of the most consistently lethal combinations in the game, and it is not just powerful, it is elegant in a mechanical sense. The two systems combine to address exactly the tactical responses a raider would use against either system alone. The timing of the pulse in the context of a broader engagement is something that raider doctrine has worked to analyze in detail, because understanding the pattern is critical to countering it. The pulse does not discharge continuously. It has a cycle, a charge period followed by a discharge, followed by what raiders describe as a recovery period, during which the attack cannot be used again. The length of this cycle, and specifically the length of the recovery window, has been studied carefully because it represents the primary safe window for close-range engagement. A raider who can identify the exact moment of pulse discharge and respond immediately has a window of time to engage at close range before the next discharge becomes possible. This window is real. It is also short, stressful, and requires a level of combat composure that not all raiders can maintain under the physical and psychological pressure of a leaper encounter. One of the more counterintuitive discoveries that experienced raiders have made about the pulse is that the leaper appears to time its discharge based on factors beyond simple charge state. There are accounts of the pulse being deployed with extended delay when the leaper was in the middle of an active leap, as if the system holds back the discharge until the machine is grounded and stable. There are also accounts of the pulse firing more quickly than expected when the leaper was closely surrounded by multiple threats, suggesting some kind of threat density response in the discharge trigger. Whether this represents genuine situational decision-making in the machine's behavior, or whether it is an artifact of the pulse system's energy management responding to physical conditions, is not clear. The practical implication is the same. The pulse cycle is not perfectly predictable, and raiders who think they have its timing completely figured out have occasionally been proven wrong at the worst possible moment. The environmental effects of repeated pulse discharges in a confined area are something that the world-building lore of Arc Raiders addresses in an understated way. Areas where leapers patrol extensively show specific terrain signatures that reflect this activity. Certain materials appear to be preferentially affected by the pulse energy, showing patterns of degradation or displacement that create a secondary record of the machine's activity history. Experienced raiders particularly those who specialize in reading surface environments before committing to a run, can sometimes estimate how long a leaper has been operating in an area based on these environmental signatures. This kind of terrain reading is extremely niche knowledge, the sort of thing that only the most dedicated leaper specialists develop, but it points to the broader reality that the leaper changes its environment over time simply by doing what it does. The question of whether the pulse serves any purpose beyond combat is one that some lore analysts in the raider community have raised. The Ark, as we have discussed, is believed to be doing something on Earth beyond simply establishing military control. If Ark machines have functions that extend into whatever that broader purpose is, might the pulse have a non-combat application? This is speculative, and the lore does not confirm it, but there are elements of the pulse's behavior that are slightly odd if you consider it purely as a combat weapon. The omnidirectional discharge pattern is effective for area denial, but it is not optimal for targeted damage. The energy magnitude is higher than what would be strictly necessary for the anti-personnel function it primarily serves. Some radar researchers, operating from limited information, have suggested that the pulse might simultaneously serve a scanning or signaling function, a way for the leaper to broadcast its position or status to other Ark units. This is one reading of the available evidence, and it is worth holding loosely. The effect of the pulse on electronic and powered equipment carried by raiders is documented in enough lore fragments to be considered established, though the exact mechanism is unclear. Raider equipment that relies on electronics or powered systems can be disrupted or damaged by proximity to a pulse discharge, which creates a secondary layer of consequences beyond the direct physical impact. A raider who survives a pulse at the edge of its radius may find their equipment malfunctioning at a moment when that equipment would be most needed. This technical vulnerability compounds the physical one, meaning that even a partial pulse hit can have consequences that extend well beyond the immediate moment. Raiders who specialize in leaper zone operations have adapted their loadouts to minimize equipment that is vulnerable to this kind of disruption, accepting capability trade-offs in exchange for reliability in pulse-heavy environments. The pulse's role in the leaper's broader patrol behavior is worth examining. The machine does not use the pulse randomly as it moves through its territory. The lore suggests that pulse deployments are contextually triggered, responding to specific conditions in the machine's environment, rather than firing on a fixed schedule. Proximity of potential threats is the obvious trigger, but there may be others. Certain environmental conditions, specific configurations of other Ark units nearby, possibly even signals or data from the broader Ark network, might influence when the pulse is deployed. This contextual triggering makes the pulse feel less like a turret firing on a timer, and more like a decision, or at least something that functions like a decision. That quality, whether genuine or simulated, contributes to the leaper's reputation as the most tactically sophisticated of the common Ark machine types. The lore contains references to raider experiments with pulse mitigation, attempts to develop equipment or tactics that reduce the pulse's effectiveness against human targets. These experiments have had partial success at best. Certain materials and equipment configurations offer some reduction in pulse effect at the outer range, enough to make a marginal difference in survivability. Nothing has been found that neutralizes the pulse entirely at any range, at least nothing that raiders with standard access to Haven resources can practically field. The failure of these mitigation attempts is itself informative. It suggests that the pulse operates on principles that human engineering, as currently practiced in the Ark Raiders world, does not fully understand. You cannot build a perfect defense against something you do not completely understand, and the pulse remains something that the raider community understands only in terms of its effects, not its mechanism. The tactical responses that the raider community has developed around the pulse can be roughly divided into three categories. The first is avoidance, simply not going to places where the leaper patrols, accepting the limitation on what resources can be accessed in exchange for not having to deal with pulse encounters at all. This approach works for raiders who do not need the highest value targets, but it fundamentally constrains what a raider operation can accomplish. The second category is management, developing tactics that reduce the frequency and severity of pulse encounters without eliminating them. This involves route planning, timing, the use of distractions and decoys, and the kind of moment-to-moment spatial awareness that only comes with extensive leaper experience. The third category is direct engagement, accepting that a pulse encounter is going to happen and developing the combat capability to survive it and defeat the leaper before the encounter becomes fatal. Each approach has its advocates in the raider community and its appropriate contexts. The management approach to pulse encounters is the one that receives the most detailed treatment in the lore, probably because it is the most commonly applicable and the most teachable. The core principle is spatial control. You need to know where the leaper is at all times, what the current charge state of its pulse approximately is, and what the terrain between you and it looks like in terms of both cover and escape routes. With this information, you can position yourself to minimize pulse exposure while still accomplishing your extraction objective. The difficulty is that gathering and maintaining this situational awareness while simultaneously doing everything else a raider needs to do on the surface is extraordinarily cognitively demanding. The leaper wins a lot of encounters not because it is faster or stronger than raiders in some absolute sense, but because it creates an information management burden that exceeds what most people can handle under stress. The pulse's interaction with the leaper's social behavior, meaning the presence of other ARC units in the same area, creates some of the most tactically complex situations in ARC raiders. The smaller, faster ARC units that patrol alongside leapers are not themselves the primary threat. They become the primary threat when they force raiders into positions that increase their pulse exposure. A group of small units pushing raiders toward a leaper or forcing them to use movement patterns that bring them closer to it is functionally acting as a support mechanism for the pulse. Whether this is coordinated behavior or emergent coincidence, the result is that the pulse's effectiveness in mixed unit encounters is considerably higher than it would be in isolation. The geometric complexity of managing your distance from a leaper while also dealing with units that are actively trying to reduce that distance is where a lot of raider deaths occur. The psychological dimension of the pulse, beyond its direct tactical effects, is something the lore addresses in survivor accounts. There is something particular about the nature of an area denial attack that affects human psychology differently from directional attacks. With a directional attack, you have agency. You can move, you can aim, you can adjust. With the pulse, within a certain radius, you have none of those things. The attack finds you wherever you are. That removal of agency is psychologically devastating in a way that pure damage output does not fully capture. Raiders describe the experience of being caught in a pulse as one of the most disorienting combat experiences on the surface, not just because of the physical effects, but because of the momentary absolute helplessness that precedes them. That feeling, and the desire to never experience it again, is a significant driver of the extreme avoidance behavior that the leaper inspires in raider communities. The lore suggests that the pulse is not the leaper's original factory configuration, or at least that is one possible reading of some fragmentary evidence. There are references in survivor logs and environmental text to encounters with what appear to be leaper-class machines that did not deploy the pulse in the standard way. Machines that seemed either to be early versions of the leaper design or damaged units operating with degraded systems. These references are too sparse to build a strong argument from, but they point toward the possibility that the pulse was either added to the leaper design at some point during the invasion, or that it is a capability that can be lost or modified through damage or operational circumstances. If the pulse is not always present in every leaper unit, then the current prevalence of pulse-capable leapers tells us something about the current phase of the ARC's operation on Earth. It suggests that the ARC has decided that area denial capability is currently a priority in the zones where leapers operate. The interaction of the pulse with the landscape, specifically with the ruins and debris that make up most of the surface play space, creates a set of secondary tactical considerations that experienced raiders have to account for. Pulse discharges can destabilize precarious debris, collapse partially standing structures, or shift large objects in ways that can harm raiders who are using them as cover. A wall you were relying on to absorb damage from small units might be shifted or partially collapsed by a nearby pulse, leaving you unexpectedly exposed. This environmental interaction means that leaper pulse encounters in built-up areas carry an extra layer of unpredictability. The pulse does not just affect you directly, it affects the terrain around you, potentially removing options that you were counting on. Experienced raiders in leaper zones are wary of relying too heavily on any single piece of cover, precisely because the pulse can change the terrain state mid-engagement. One of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the pulse, from a lore interpretation perspective, is what it suggests about the Ark's model of human combat. The pulse is an effective counter to exactly the behavioral pattern that humans most commonly exhibit when threatened, which is seeking cover and reducing their movement profile. The pulse punishes exactly that. It punishes the instinct to get low, get close to a wall, reduce exposure. A weapon designed to counter the natural human response to threat is a weapon that was designed with knowledge of human behavior. The Ark presumably has this knowledge from the long history of the invasion, from observing how raiders and other surface humans have responded to Ark machine encounters. If the pulse is a product of that accumulated behavioral knowledge, then it represents something close to a designed vulnerability, an attack built to exploit specifically human tendencies. That is a profoundly unsettling reading of what the pulse is. The pulse's legacy in raider culture is one of the more durable elements of how the leaper is represented in community knowledge. Specific pulse encounters, near misses, full hits survived against the odds, team wipes attributed to single pulses. These stories circulate in Haven communities in ways that build the leaper's reputation more than any abstract description of its capabilities could. The pulse is what raiders remember, not the size of the machine, not even the leap, dramatic as it is. The pulse is the thing that stays with you, the thing that appears in the particular kind of stress responses that surface veterans carry with them after years of leaper encounters. Understanding the pulse is not just a tactical matter. In the world of Ark Raiders, it is a cultural one. The intersection of the pulse with the leaper's overall design philosophy brings us back to the conclusion we reached at the end of the previous chapter. Everything about the leaper was designed to make it maximally effective against specifically human adversaries in a specifically post-collapse Earth environment. The pulse is the cleanest expression of this design philosophy because it attacks something that is not a physical capability but a behavioral tendency. Human beings under threat seek cover and reduce movement. The pulse says no to that. It forces movement, forces exposure, forces exactly the kind of behavior that makes you easier to hit with a leap or vulnerable to the smaller units that support the leaper. The pulse does not just damage you. It disciplines you. It trains you over painful, repeated experience to move in ways that the leaper is better positioned to exploit. In that sense, the pulse is not just an attack. It is a lesson, one that the leaper teaches again and again until either the raider learns or the raider is not around to apply the lesson. Chapter 4: Apex Predator by Proxy. The leaper's role in Ark tactical formations. The leaper is rarely alone. This is perhaps the single most important tactical reality about the machine, the thing that separates encounters that raiders can manage from encounters that are genuinely lethal by design. The lore is consistent on this point across multiple fragment types, survivor accounts, environmental reading, in-game text. The leaper is found with other machines, not always the same other machines, and not always in the same configuration, but the pattern is real and persistent enough that a raider who finds a leaper and does not immediately start looking for its company units has made a potentially fatal oversight. Understanding why the leaper is found in these configurations and what the configurations accomplish together is essential to understanding the machine's role in the Ark's broader operational structure. The most commonly documented leaper configuration, referred to in raider slang with several different terms, depending on the Haven community, pairs the large quadruped with a variable number of smaller, faster Ark units. These smaller units have their own names and their own lore, but for the purpose of understanding the leaper, what matters most is their behavioral profile in proximity to the larger machine. They are quick. They are directionally aggressive, meaning they tend to advance toward targets rather than maintaining position. They create a harassment function that forces raiders to track multiple threat axes simultaneously. In isolation, they are dangerous but manageable by experienced raiders. In combination with a leaper, they become something qualitatively different because every movement you make to deal with them changes your position relative to the leaper. The geometric logic of the combined leaper plus small units formation is worth working through explicitly because it reveals the elegance of the design. When small units are advancing from multiple directions, Raiders tend to use movement to break lines of attack, shifting position to avoid being flanked or surrounded. This movement, which is tactically sound in isolation, constantly changes the raider's distance and angle relative to the leaper. Sometimes that movement brings raiders closer to the leaper. Sometimes it brings them into more open ground, where the leaper's leap is more effective. Sometimes it puts them in positions with less cover around the leaper's position, increasing pulse exposure. The small units are not coordinated with the leaper in the sense of explicit communication, but their presence forces the kind of raider movement that maximizes the leaper's effectiveness. The result feels coordinated even if it is not. The question of whether ARC machines coordinate in any meaningful way is one that the law explores without resolving. There are observations that suggest genuine information sharing between ARC units, behaviors that only make sense if one machine is acting on data from another. There are other observations that suggest the appearance of coordination is emergent, a product of multiple machines with complementary behavioral patterns operating in the same space, rather than anything like explicit tactical communication. The leaper small unit combination could fit either interpretation. It could be that the leaper and its companion units share targeting data and respond to each other's behavior in real time. Or it could be that their respective behavioral programs naturally produce complementary patterns when they occupy the same space. For raiders, the distinction is academic. The practical consequence is the same. What the law does suggest, fairly consistently, is that the ARC deploys its machines with some consideration of unit mix. You do not find leapers in areas populated exclusively by other leaper-class machines. You do not find leapers completely isolated. The consistent presence of complementary unit types in leaper zones points toward an ARC operational logic that accounts for combined arms effectiveness, even if the specific mechanisms by which that logic is implemented remain unclear. Whether this is a deployment AI that calculates optimal unit combinations, a fixed doctrine built into machine behavioral programming, or simply that the ARC produces different machine types in specific ratios that naturally result in these combinations in the field, is not something the available law can definitively answer. The layered threat structure that leaper formations create is documented extensively in Raider tactical law, and the consistent conclusion across these accounts is that dealing with the leaper requires either eliminating the companion units first, which takes time and attention, during which the leaper is free to position itself, or maintaining a constant spatial awareness of the leaper's position, while simultaneously managing the smaller threats, which requires a level of multitasking that is very difficult to sustain. Some Raider teams specialize in a division of attention approach, where specific team members are designated to track and manage the leaper's position and pulse cycle, while others deal with smaller units. This approach works when teams are well practiced and communication is good, which it frequently is not under the stress of a live encounter. The leaper's positioning behavior within a mixed unit formation is something that the law describes in a way that is consistent with it having some kind of role awareness. It tends not to be the first unit to engage raiders when a formation encounters a threat. The smaller, faster units advance, while the leaper maintains positioning or moves to a flanking or elevated approach. The leaper waits, which is not a word that comes naturally when describing a machine, but which accurately captures the behavioral pattern that raiders report. It waits until the smaller units have created the positioning conditions that favor its own attack methods. Whether this represents tactical judgment or simply behavioral programming that produces this sequencing as a default output is again one of those questions the law leaves open. The consequence of the leaper's wait behavior is that it often becomes the last unit standing in an encounter, after raiders have spent resources and attention dealing with its companion units. By the time the team turns its full attention to the leaper, it has had time to reach an optimal position, and the raiders are depleted in both physical resources and psychological energy. The raiders who survive to tell about these encounters most often report that the final confrontation with the leaper, after the companion units were dealt with, felt like fighting the leaper at its best, while they were at their worst. The formation, whether by design or emergent behavior, maximizes this asymmetry. There is an additional element to the leaper formation dynamic that the law touches on, which is the effect of the leaper's presence on how raiders perceive and respond to the companion units. Knowing a leaper is in the area changes how raiders engage with every other element of the encounter. They are less willing to advance aggressively to close down the small units, because advancing might bring them into leaper range. They are less willing to use the kinds of movement that would be tactically optimal against the small units, because that movement might be unfavorable relative to the leaper's position. The leaper does not have to do anything to constrain raider behavior. Its presence alone is sufficient to reduce the raider's tactical freedom significantly. This is area denial, achieved not through attack, but through the credible threat of attack, and it is one of the most effective things the leaper does. The specific types of companion units found most commonly with leapers seem to vary by location and possibly by arc operational phase. In some zones, the companion units are primarily scouts or harassers, quick machines that move in and out of engagement range, forcing raider attention without committing to sustained combat. In other zones, the companions are more persistent fighters that will hold positions and trade fire. The nature of the companion units affects the tactical calculus significantly because they determine how much of your attention needs to be on them as opposed to on the leaper. The law suggests that both companion configurations have been observed in genuine field encounters, which means raiders in leaper zones need to assess the companion type as well as the leaper itself before developing a response approach. The leaper's behavior when its companion units are all eliminated is one of the more interesting tactical questions in the law. Some accounts describe the leaper becoming more aggressive after its companions are gone, as if the loss of companion units triggers an escalation state. Others describe the leaper maintaining its standard behavioral pattern regardless of companion status, which would support the interpretation that it does not process companion state as tactically relevant information. The inconsistency between these accounts is itself interesting. It might reflect genuine variability in leaper behavior, or it might reflect the difficulty of accurate observation under combat stress, or it might indicate that the leaper's response to companion loss depends on factors like its own damage state or the specific configuration of the encounter. Without more controlled observation, this question remains open. The use of leaper formations to guard specific types of objectives is consistent enough in the law to be considered essentially established. High-value extraction targets, structures with apparent arc operational significance, corridor choke points that control access to larger areas of the map. These are the locations where raider teams most consistently encounter mixed leaper formations. This distribution is meaningful because it tells us something about arc operational priority. The arc does not put leapers everywhere. It puts them where it matters most that raiders do not succeed. The companion units amplify the leaper's effectiveness at exactly those most critical points. The arc, or the system that directs arc deployment, appears to understand compound deterrence. A leaper alone is very dangerous. A leaper with well-chosen companions is a different category of obstacle entirely. The raider responds to recognizing that they have encountered a leaper formation rather than an isolated leaper is well documented in tactical law, and the first response is almost universally assessment before action. The experienced raider who spots a leaper immediately starts counting, looking for the companion units before deciding on an approach. The number and type of companions, their current positions and engagement states, the terrain around the leaper's position, and the resources available to the raider team all factor into the assessment. The time pressure to complete this assessment before the formation detects the raiders and initiates contact is severe. This is why raider specialists in leaper zones tend to be people who can process a complex tactical picture very quickly and communicate it clearly to their team in very few words. The skill set is narrow and specific, and those who have it are valued accordingly. The law around haven communities includes references to training for leaper formation encounters, which is one of the clearest indicators of how seriously this threat is taken. Raiders who are new to the surface are given simulation-level preparation for single arc machine encounters, then for encounters with multiple units of the same type, and then specifically for mixed leaper formations. The latter training is described in law fragments as the most difficult and most important of the three levels, which says something about where the community places the leaper formation in its threat hierarchy. It is not just the hardest thing on the surface. It is the thing that requires the most specific preparation, the thing that purely generic combat competence is insufficient to handle. The psychological preparation for leaper formation encounters is treated differently from the tactical preparation in the law, and this distinction is important. Tactically, you can practice approaches, routes, timing, priority sequences. Psychologically, the challenge is different. It is about managing the combination of threats without losing focus on any single element, maintaining the ability to make clear decisions under the specific kind of pressure that a leaper formation generates. Raider trainers and community leaders who address this in the law tend to emphasize that the psychological preparation for a leaper formation encounter is not about being fearless. It is about having a response protocol so internalized that fear does not disrupt its execution. The formation is designed to generate fear. Your preparation is the counter to that design. The role of the leaper in ARC tactical formations extends beyond its direct combat effectiveness to its function as an information node. The observation that leapers may have enhanced sensor capabilities relative to smaller ARC units suggests that they serve a detection function within their formation, identifying threats and potentially sharing that information with companion units. Under this interpretation, the leaper is not just a heavy hitter in the formation, it is also the eyes and ears, the unit most capable of detecting raiders at distance and triggering the formation's response. This dual function, detection and devastation, would explain why leaper formations are so difficult to approach stealthily. The smaller companion units might be evadable. The leaper's sensors make evasion of the entire formation significantly harder once it is in detection range. The specific patrol dynamics of a leaper formation, as opposed to a single unit, create additional complexity for raider planning. The units do not necessarily maintain fixed spacing. The small units may range ahead or to the sides of the leaper's position, extending the formation's effective sensor and engagement footprint significantly. The leaper itself may change its position within the formation based on terrain and approach, moving to higher ground for better sightlines, or positioning near choke points that restrict raider approach options. The result is a formation that is not a fixed shape, but a dynamic system that adapts to some degree to the terrain it occupies. Planning a route through a leaper formation zone requires accounting for this dynamic nature, not just the static positions that the formation might occupy at one specific moment. The concept of the leaper as the command element of its formation is one that some raider analysts propose based on behavioral observation, though the law does not explicitly support this interpretation. The argument goes roughly as follows. In observations of leaper formations, the small unit's behavior appears to become somewhat less coordinated after the leaper is incapacitated, even before they are individually engaged. If the leaper were providing some form of coordination signal to companion units, its elimination would logically reduce that signal and affect companion behavior. This argument is circumstantial, and there are other explanations for the observed companion behavior change after leaper incapacitation. But the interpretation is not obviously wrong, and it has influenced raider tactics in some communities, leading to approaches that prioritize the leaper rather than the companion units, accepting the greater immediate danger of engaging the leaper first in exchange for potentially disrupting the formation's effectiveness as a whole. Whether or not the leaper functions as a command node, the prioritization debate itself is significant as a piece of law about how raider communities have adapted to this specific threat. The fact that there are organized arguments in favor of leaper first versus companion first approaches reflects how seriously the raider community has taken the leaper formation problem and how much collective thought has gone into developing responses. The debate is not resolved in the law. Both approaches have succeeded and both have failed in documented encounters. The practical conclusion that most experienced raiders reach is that the right prioritization depends on the specific formation, the specific terrain, and the specific resources available, and that the ability to make that judgment call accurately in real time is itself one of the core skills of operating in leaper zones. The leaper formation's relationship to other ARC machines in the broader environmental context is worth examining briefly. Leaper formations do not exist in isolation from the rest of the ARC presence in an area. They are typically part of a larger network of ARC machine activity that includes other unit types and other patrol systems. This means that an encounter with a leaper formation is rarely the only ARC encounter of a given run. Raiders in leaper zones have to plan for the broader machine presence in the area, including what happens if a Leaper formation engagement creates noise or detections that alert other ARC units in the vicinity. The possibility of additional ARC units arriving during an already challenging Leaper formation engagement is a genuine tactical concern that experienced raiders account for explicitly in their planning. The Leaper formation is difficult enough on its own. Adding an interruption by additional units during that engagement is a scenario that most raider teams simply do not survive. The long-term consequences for raider operations in areas where Leaper formations are consistently present are documented in the broader world-building of ARC raiders. These areas tend to be visited less frequently by smaller proportions of the raider population and by teams that are more specifically prepared for the challenge. The economic consequence is that resources in those areas circulate less freely through haven communities. The social consequence is that the teams specialized in Leaper zone operations develop a distinct subculture, sharing knowledge and experience that is not accessible to general-purpose raiders. The Leaper formation, in this sense, does not just affect combat outcomes, it shapes the social and economic structure of the haven communities that send raiders to the surface. It creates specializations, hierarchies of knowledge, and a specific kind of earned status that only comes from surviving what most raiders avoid. The chapter closes on the following observation. The Leaper's tactical effectiveness is real and significant in isolation, but the Leaper formation is something considerably more than the sum of its parts. The combination of the Leaper's direct capabilities with the behavioral demands that companion units create produces a threat profile that is specifically calibrated to exceed what generic, competent raiders can handle. It requires specific preparation, specific knowledge, and specific psychological resilience. The ARC, or the system that determined ARC deployment doctrine, seems to understand that the most effective deterrence is not the strongest possible single machine, but the configuration of machines that is most likely to defeat the specific entity you are trying to deter. Against human raiders with finite attention and resources, that configuration appears to be the Leaper and its company. It is not a coincidence that this combination is found exactly where the ARC most needs raiders not to succeed. Chapter 5. Known and Feared, the Leaper in Raider Culture and Community Knowledge. There is a particular kind of reputation that only the most dangerous things earn in closed communities under extreme stress. It is not the reputation of the simply powerful, the thing that kills you if you stand in front of it. It is the reputation of the thing that reorganizes how the whole community thinks and operates, the thing whose existence changes what is considered possible, what is worth attempting, and how people talk about the surface when they come back. The Leaper has earned that reputation in raider communities in ways that are documented in the law with a consistency that is itself meaningful. This is not just a dangerous machine, it is a cultural fixture. And the way it has become a cultural fixture tells us as much about the people who fear it as it does about the machine itself. The earliest references to the Leaper in raider community law, reconstructed from fragmentary survivor accounts and haven records, are instructive precisely because they predate the full understanding of the machine's capabilities. In these early references, the Leaper is described with a mixture of accurate physical observation and significant underestimation of its combat effectiveness. The four-legged design was correctly identified, the size was correctly noted. The leap was mentioned, though early descriptions of its range were shorter than later accounts would establish as accurate. The pulse was either absent from early encounters, present but not yet fully understood, or simply not survived by anyone in a position to report on it clearly. The picture that emerges is of a community gradually building an accurate threat assessment through the expensive process of direct experience. The transition from underestimation to respect in raider community knowledge about the Leaper appears to have happened in a relatively short window. The law suggests a period during which Leaper encounters were becoming more frequent, possibly because raiders were pushing into areas that they had previously avoided due to other factors, and during which the casualty rate from those encounters was high enough to demand attention. The response was the kind of rapid knowledge sharing that communities under survival pressure excel at. Oral tradition, shorthand warnings, simple rules of thumb that could be communicated quickly and memorized under stress. Stay out of the open, watch for the crouch, don't bunch up. These kinds of simple tactical aphorisms about the Leaper show up in lore fragments from this period, reflecting a community that was working to codify its hard-won experience before more people paid the price to learn the same lessons. The formal knowledge structures that developed around the Leaper in more established Haven communities represent a more sophisticated stage of this process. Some of the larger, better resourced havens in the lore appear to have developed something close to a curriculum around surface threat recognition and response, within which the Leaper occupies a significant portion of the advanced material. The existence of these curricula reflects both the seriousness with which the Leaper threat is taken and the recognition that the knowledge required to operate safely around Leapers is not something that can be improvised in the field. It has to be taught before the encounter, internalized to the point where it can be applied under the conditions that the encounter creates. The figure of the Leaper specialist, raiders who have developed unusual depth of knowledge and experience specifically around Leaper encounters, is a recurring presence in the broader Ark Raiders lore. These individuals are not necessarily the most physically capable raiders or the most decorated in terms of overall surface career achievement. They are the people who have survived enough Leaper encounters, studied them carefully enough, and thought about them systematically enough to have genuine expertise. In Haven communities, their knowledge is respected and sought in a way that goes beyond ordinary raider status. A Leaper specialist's assessment of a planned run route that passes through Leaper zones carries weight that overrides the general confidence of more senior raiders who lack that specific experience. The Leaper has, in other words, created its own category of expertise and the social structures that recognize and value it. The stories that circulate in Haven communities about specific Leaper encounters fall into recognizable narrative categories. There are survival stories, where the point is how close the raider came to not surviving and what saved them. There are cautionary tales, where the point is what was done wrong and what the consequence was. There are more ambivalent accounts, where neither the outcome nor the lessons learned are entirely clear, and which tend to be the most honest representations of what Leaper encounters are actually like. And there are the legendary accounts, encounters that have been told and retold enough to have taken on a quality that extends beyond simple tactical information into something closer to myth. These legendary accounts always feature the Leaper doing something extraordinary, a leap of unusual distance, a pulse that should have killed everyone and did not, a machine that was thought to be down that was not. The extraordinary is what gets remembered and transmitted. The Leaper's place in Haven cultural expression, beyond simple tactical knowledge, is hinted at in lore fragments that touch on art, music, and informal communication in the underground communities. There are references to imagery of the Leaper appearing in the visual culture of some havens, stylized representations of the four-legged form that function as shorthand for danger, as warnings, as markers of territory, or of respect for the surface's most serious threats. There are lyrical references in the informal music of raider communities, songs, or rhythmic chants in which the Leaper features as a central threat figure. These cultural expressions are fragments barely developed in the available lore, but they point toward a reality where the Leaper's influence on human experience has extended beyond the tactical into the emotional and expressive. The language that different Haven communities have developed around the Leaper is itself a piece of lore worth examining. The variety of slang terms, nicknames, and shorthand references for the machine across different communities reflects how independently each community has processed its experience with the threat. Some communities use names that emphasize the physical form, terms that reference the four-legged shape or the size. Others use names that emphasize the primary danger, terms built around the leap or the pulse. Still others have developed names that are more abstract, words that carry cultural weight that only make sense within that specific community's history with the machine. This linguistic variety is evidence of the depth to which the Leaper has penetrated individual community culture, rather than simply existing as a generic, recognized threat. The transmission of Leaper knowledge between Haven communities is not automatic or guaranteed. The underground society of Ark Raiders is not a unified organization with standardized information sharing. Different havens have different relationships, different levels of contact, different approaches to managing information as a resource. The consequence is that knowledge about the Leaper, including tactical innovations and updated behavioral observations, can be significantly more developed in some communities than in others. A haven that has been sending raiders into Leaper zones for years and has built up detailed institutional knowledge about the machine is in a completely different position than one that is just beginning to encounter it. The law reflects this disparity, with accounts of raiders from less informed communities making mistakes that better informed ones would consider elementary. The sharing of Leaper tactical knowledge is itself depicted in the law as an act with social and political dimensions, not just an information exchange. Knowledge about how to survive Leaper encounters has value, and value in the Ark Raiders world creates incentives around both sharing and withholding. Some communities are generous with their Leaper knowledge, recognizing that the cumulative benefit of better informed raiders across multiple communities outweighs the competitive advantage of exclusivity. Others are more proprietary, treating detailed Leaper knowledge as a competitive edge that contributes to their survival advantage relative to other communities they compete with for the same surface resources. The Leaper, in this way, has become not just a tactical challenge, but a political one. The emotional relationship between experienced raiders and the Leaper is something that the law captures with considerable complexity in the accounts of those who have operated extensively in Leaper zones. Unambiguous fear is present and acknowledged, but so is something more complicated. A familiarity that comes from extensive experience with a particular threat, a professional respect for the machine's design and effectiveness, and in some accounts, something almost like a relationship. The sense that the Leaper has become a known quantity in a way that makes it simultaneously more predictable and more personally significant. Raiders who have operated around Leapers for years do not fear them the same way a novice does. They have fear that is more specific, more informed, and in some ways more controlled. But the depth of experience seems to add rather than subtract from the weight of the machine's presence in their psychology. The accounts of raiders who have deliberately chosen to specialize in Leaper zone operations, as opposed to those who simply encountered the machine frequently due to operational necessity, reveal an interesting self-selection. These individuals tend to describe the challenge of the Leaper specifically as something they sought out, not because they are not afraid of it, but because the specific problem of operating effectively in the presence of the most sophisticated and dangerous Ark machine on the surface represents a level of challenge that they find worth pursuing. This is not presented in the law as bravado. It is described in terms of craft, of specific skill development, of the satisfaction of mastering something that most cannot. The Leaper, from this perspective, is not just a threat to be survived. It is a benchmark to be reached. The community response to raider deaths in Leaper encounters follows patterns that are visible in the law and that reflect how deeply the threat is embedded in community consciousness. Deaths attributed to the Leaper are processed differently than deaths attributed to other Ark machines or to competitor raiders. There is a specific quality to the grief and the storytelling that surrounds Leaper deaths that reflects their particular nature. The sense that the raider died because the Leaper is specifically what it is, not through bad luck or a random shot, but through a confrontation with a machine that was simply very well designed for the specific thing it did. This specificity of attribution affects how the death is discussed, how the lessons are drawn from it, and how the community uses the story to educate future raiders. The memorialization of prominent raider deaths in Leaper encounters is one of the more poignant elements of the lore around this machine. Haven communities keep some form of record of their dead, either formal or informal, and the accounts of those who died in Leaper encounters tend to include more tactical detail than accounts of deaths from other causes. This is practical, the detail is meant to be instructive, but it also reflects the community's sense that Leaper deaths deserve more explanation, that there is more to understand about what happened, and why that the Leaper demands a more complete accounting. The machine, in death, continues to be an educator. The evolution of community knowledge about the Leaper over the timeline of the Ark invasion, as best as it can be reconstructed from lore fragments, suggests a progressive deepening rather than a dramatic revelation. Early knowledge was basic and expensive to acquire. Later knowledge built on earlier knowledge, adding nuance and precision. The most current community understanding, reflected in the lore available in the game's current state, is sophisticated and detailed, representing years of accumulated experience and systematic observation. But it is still not complete. There are still aspects of the Leaper's behavior that are not fully understood, still questions about its role in the Ark system that do not have definitive answers. The knowledge, like the threat itself, continues to develop, the specifically Raider-centric nature of Leaper knowledge is a limitation worth acknowledging. Everything we know about the Leaper is filtered through human perception, human categories, and human survival priorities. What the Leaper is to the Ark, how it understands its own function if it understands it at all, what a Leaper encounter looks like from the inside of the machine's sensory and processing systems. These are perspectives the lore does not attempt to provide. The Leaper is always observed from the outside, from the viewpoint of the hunted, rather than the hunter. That limitation is unavoidable given the nature of the source material, but it is worth keeping in mind as we interpret the lore. What we know about the Leaper is what the Leaper looks like to the people it threatens. That is a partial picture, and it is one that is inevitably coloured by the fear and high stakes that attend every observation. The comparison of Leaper lore across different Ark Raiders source material, in-game text versus environmental detail versus survivor accounts versus behavioural observation, shows a consistency that is reassuring for interpretive purposes. The broad strokes of what the Leaper does and how it behaves are consistent across all source types. The finer details show more variation, some of which reflects genuine variability in Leaper behavior, some of which reflects the limits of observation under stress, and some of which may reflect actual variation between individual Leaper units or between Leapers in different operational contexts. This consistency at the broad level, with variation at the fine level, is actually what you would expect from a machine species that has a core design, but some degree of variability in implementation and operation. It is another indicator that the Leaper, for all its alien origin, behaves in ways that are fundamentally comprehensible, even if not fully understood. The way Raider communities talk about the Leaper to people who have never encountered it reflects an interesting communicative challenge. The machine's danger is not fully conveyable in description. The experience of encountering it, the speed of the leap, the helplessness of being inside the pulse radius, the cognitive load of managing a formation that includes it, these things resist adequate verbal representation. Experienced raiders describe a consistent failure in their attempts to prepare novices through words alone. The novice hears the description and believes they understand. They do not. The gap between understanding the description of the Leaper and understanding the Leaper can only be closed through encounter, which is exactly what everyone is trying to avoid until they are ready for it. This communicative failure is itself a kind of tribute to the machine. It is dangerous in ways that exceed language. The Leaper's status in the informal hierarchy of Ark threats that Raider communities maintain reflects its unique combination of properties. It is not the rarest Ark machine. It is not the one with the highest single-hit damage output. It is not the one that appears in the greatest numbers. But in the composite assessment of challenge, danger, and influence on Raider decision-making, it consistently ranks at or near the top of community evaluations. This aggregate ranking is the clearest expression of how Raider culture has processed the Leaper threat over time. It is not the thing most likely to kill you in a specific moment. It is the thing most likely to define whether a run succeeds or fails, to reorganize how a team plans, to require specific preparation that nothing else on the surface demands. In that sense, it is the most important Ark machine in the game, even if it is not always the most immediately lethal. The final cultural dimension of the Leaper worth addressing in this chapter is the machine's function as a boundary marker. In the mental map that every experienced raider carries of their operational territory, the Leaper's known patrol zones mark the edges of what is attempted casually, and the beginning of what requires specific commitment. Zones without Leapers are standard operating territory. Zones with Leapers are something different. They require more preparation, more caution, more specific knowledge. The transition from one to the other is not marked on any map. It is marked in the mind of every raider who has learned where the Leapers are and what going past those boundaries means. The Leaper is, in this way, the Ark's most effective enforcer, not because it kills more raiders than other machines, but because it shapes the space around itself in ways that persist in human decision-making long after the machine itself is out of sight. Chapter 6: What the Leaper Guards, High-Risk Zones, and Ark Operational Logic. If the Leaper exists to protect something, then understanding what it protects is one of the most direct routes into understanding the Ark's actual agenda on Earth. The lore in Ark Raiders does not provide a clean answer to what the Ark is doing. but it provides enough contextual evidence that reasonable interpretations are possible. The leaper's consistent presence in specific types of locations is one of the most reliable data points in that evidence base. Where the leaper is tells us something about what the arc considers important, and what the arc considers important tells us something about what the arc actually is and what it is here to do. The most obvious category of location where leapers are found is structures with apparent arc operational significance. These are buildings or complexes where evidence of arc activity beyond simple patrol is visible, machinery that has been interfaced with or modified by arc units, areas where the physical environment shows signs of sustained arc presence beyond what normal patrol would produce, collections of arc components or materials that suggest assembly, storage, or processing activity. These locations, when raiders access them, tend to contain the most valuable extractable resources, which reflects the game's reward structure, but also its lore logic. The places the arc cares most about protecting happen to be the places that are most worth raiding. The specific nature of the arc activity at these locations is something the lore deliberately obscures. The evidence is there, the modified environments, the materials, the signs of sustained presence. But what the arc is actually doing is presented as unknown or unknowable to the raiders who observe it. This epistemic limitation is realistic, given the narrative context. Raiders are not scientists with the tools and time to conduct systematic analysis. They are people trying to grab what is valuable and get out alive. Their observations are necessarily partial and filtered through survival priorities rather than intellectual inquiry. The lore thus gives us the observation that something is happening at these locations without providing a clean explanation of what, and the leaper's presence is the clearest signal that whatever is happening matters enough to the arc to merit serious defense. One category of arc operational location that appears in the lore is what raiders have come to call relay structures, sites that appear to be involved in some kind of signal propagation or communication function for the arc network. These are identified primarily by specific equipment configurations that raiders have learned to recognize through accumulated experience, configurations that are consistent across multiple sites in different geographic areas. The consistency suggests that these are not improvised local arc operations, but part of a coherent network-level infrastructure. Leapers are disproportionately common in proximity to these relay structures, which supports the interpretation that the arc prioritizes their protection specifically. If the arc's effectiveness depends on maintaining this network, then degrading the relay infrastructure would matter to arc operations, and defending it with leapers would be a logical response. A second category of high-priority arc location that the lore connects to leaper presence is what might be called extraction or processing sites. These are areas where the physical evidence suggests that the arc is collecting or processing something from the environment. Raw materials in some cases, energy in others, based on the equipment signatures raiders observe. The specific thing being extracted varies by site, but the pattern of extraction activity connected to leaper security is consistent enough to be noted. Under the interpretation of the arc as a harvesting apparatus, rather than purely a military force, these extraction sites are where the arc is actually doing what it came to do. The leapers around them are not guarding military positions. They are guarding the work. The territorial logic of leaper deployment, as reconstructed from the accumulated mapping of raider encounter data over time, suggests that the machine's presence is not evenly distributed across the surface. There are zones with high leaper concentrations and zones with essentially none. The high concentration zones correlate with the types of locations described above: arc-modified structures, relay sites, extraction operations. The low concentration zones tend to be areas of lower apparent arc operational significance, places where arc machines patrol, but where the density of patrol suggests simple area coverage rather than specific site protection. This distribution pattern supports the interpretation that leaper deployment is strategic rather than random, assigned to locations that require it rather than deployed as a general surface presence. The relationship between leaper deployment zones and the resource map as experienced by raiders creates one of the central tensions of the game that the lore encodes. The resources most worth extracting are in the places the arc most wants protected. This is not a coincidence in narrative terms. It reflects a design logic where the game rewards risk in proportion to the danger accepted. but it also makes lore sense. The places most worth raiding are most valuable precisely because the Ark considers them important enough to defend heavily. If the Ark thought nothing of value was there, it would not bother with serious defense. The Leaper's presence is therefore a kind of endorsement. Where you find a Leaper, you are probably in a place worth the risk. The specific terrain features of high Leaper zones are consistent enough across the lore to be considered characteristic. These are not random environmental features. They are the kinds of terrain that support both Ark operational activity and Leaper patrol effectiveness simultaneously. Open spaces for Leaper mobility. Structures that can serve as both Ark operational sites and Leaper patrol anchors. Approaches that can be controlled from a limited number of access points. The terrain of Leaper zones, in other words, is terrain that serves Ark purposes on multiple levels at once. The Leaper is not simply deployed to terrain that happens to contain valuable objectives. The objectives, the terrain, and the Leaper all fit together in a configuration that serves Ark needs comprehensively. The question of whether Ark operational sites in Leaper zones show evidence of ongoing activity or completed activity is something that changes the interpretation significantly. Sites where the Ark is actively doing something, currently, in the present tense of the game's timeline, carry a different implication than sites where Ark activity happened at some point in the past and has since ceased. The lore suggests that at least some of the sites where Leapers are found are sites of ongoing Ark activity. The evidence is the freshness of certain signs, the presence of active rather than dormant Ark machinery, the density of Ark unit patrols, including Leapers. This ongoing activity reading is consistent with the interpretation that the Ark's operation on Earth is not complete, that it is still in the middle of whatever it is doing here, and that raiders are interrupting an active process rather than looting an abandoned one. The implication of interrupted active Ark operations for the broader lore is significant. If the Ark is still working, still executing whatever plan brought it to Earth, then raiders are not simply surviving in the aftermath of an invasion. They are operating in the middle of an ongoing process, one that the Ark has not finished and does not appear to be finished with. The Leaper, from this perspective, is not a machine left behind to maintain order in a conquered territory. It is part of an active, ongoing system. Its protection of specific sites reflects current operational priorities, not historical ones. This reading gives the Leaper's role a sense of urgency that it would not have if the Ark were simply an occupying force. It is executing a mission, and the Leaper is how it makes sure that mission continues. The effect of successful raider operations in Leaper zones on the broader balance of the surface is a topic that the lore addresses in a way that suggests consequences extend beyond the individual run. When raiders successfully extract from Leaper-protected sites, the implication is that they have disrupted something the Ark was doing. Whether that disruption has lasting consequences for Ark operations or whether the Ark simply adapts and continues is not fully explored in the available lore, but the framing suggests that it matters. The Ark responds to disruptions. Machine patrols shift. New units appear. The scale and nature of the response hints at how significant the disrupted operation was. Heavy response, including additional Leaper deployment, suggests that what was disrupted was important. The escalation of Ark response in areas where raiders have been active is one of the most significant world-building details in the lore from a narrative perspective. It suggests that the Ark is not static, that it reacts to what happens on the surface rather than simply executing a pre-programmed routine. The deployment of additional Leapers in response to raider activity in specific zones is the clearest version of this adaptive response, and it creates a feedback loop in the lore where successful raider operations make future operations more difficult. This dynamic is consistent with the broader interpretation of the Ark as an intelligent system rather than a simple machine network. It learns, or at least adjusts, based on input from the surface, and the Leaper is one of its primary adjustment mechanisms. The zones that become highest Leaper density areas over the course of the game's timeline are predictably the zones where raiders have been most active and most effective. The Ark's deployment response maps directly to the history of successful raider operations. This creates a kind of environmental history that players who pay attention to the lore can read. A zone with many Leapers has a history of significant raider activity. The machine density is a record of what raiders have done there, and how seriously the Ark has taken the need to respond. The Leaper, in this reading, is not just a present danger, it is a historical document. The implications of this historical reading for the broader narrative of Ark raiders are substantial. The current state of the surface, with its specific distribution of machine types and densities, reflects the cumulative history of the human-Ark interaction since the invasion began. Every successful raider operation that disrupted Ark activities contributed to the Ark's learning about where and how to deploy its defensive resources. The current Leaper distribution is, in some sense, a portrait of what humanity has accomplished and what it has failed at on the surface. Where the Leapers are densest, humanity has fought hardest. Where they are sparse, either the fights did not happen, or humanity lost so completely that continuing to fight was not possible. The specific objectives that raiders most commonly seek in Leaper zones are described in the lore with enough specificity to suggest their importance to haven communities. Medical supplies, particularly those not reproducible underground, technical components for equipment repair and manufacture, data storage systems that might contain information valuable for understanding the Ark or the pre-invasion world, energy sources that can supplement haven power systems, food production materials for agricultural expansion. These are the resources that make Leaper Zone raids worth the cost, and the cost is high enough that the value has to be correspondingly significant. The lore reflects a genuine trade-off that is calculated differently by different communities based on their specific needs and their specific Leaper encounter capabilities. The prioritization of objectives within Leaper zones by different raider teams reflects the diversity of haven community needs and capabilities. A community with strong medical infrastructure but limited food production capability will send raiders into Leaper zones for different things than a community with the opposite profile. The Leaper's role as a gatekeeper to these resources means that it indirectly shapes the economic and material reality of haven communities based on what their raiders can access. Havens with better Leaper encounter capabilities have access to more of the surface's critical resources. This advantage compounds over time, creating stratification within the broader community of underground survivors that is traced directly to Leaper encounter capability. The arc of the lore around what the Leaper guards, taken in its entirety, suggests a picture of the Ark as an organization with genuine priorities and operational logic, not just a destructive force. The things it guards are not chosen randomly. The locations where Leapers are deployed are consistently the locations of the Ark's most important activities: relay infrastructure, extraction operations, active processing sites. The Leaper is deployed as a function of those priorities, and its presence is the clearest signal available to raiders of where the Ark's priorities actually lie. This signal is valuable beyond its immediate tactical implications. It is a map of the Ark's intentions written in the deployment of its most capable common defensive unit. Reading that map correctly is one of the most important skills a raider operating in Leaper zones can develop. Chapter 7: The Leap Itself, Distance, Velocity, and the Physics of Fear. The leap is the thing. Of all the Leaper's capabilities, the one that defines its name, defines its reputation, and defines the experience of encountering it, the leap is the centerpiece. There is something about an attack that covers enormous distance in a fraction of a second that bypasses the rational threat assessment process and goes directly to something more primitive. You see the machine moving, you see it load, and then it is on top of you before the cognitive process of deciding how to respond has finished running. The leap is faster than decision-making at close range. It is designed to be. Understanding the mechanics of the leap and what they imply about the leaper's design is the subject of this chapter, and the mechanics are worth examining in detail because they reveal the engineering sophistication of a machine that in some respects does not look as sophisticated as it is. The range of the leaper's leap is documented in raider lore with varying precision because precise measurement is difficult under field conditions, and the leap range appears to vary somewhat based on factors including the machine's current state, the terrain it is launching from, and possibly the nature of the target. The consistent picture that emerges from aggregating raider accounts is that the leap covers distances that are substantially greater than raiders initially expect. Early estimates in community law significantly underestimated the range. The correction of these estimates happened through painful experience, with raiders who thought they were at safe distance discovering they were not in ways that did not allow them to report the correction. The current understanding, built on this accumulated experience, treats the leaper's leap range as extending to distances that most raiders are instinctively reluctant to call safe. The physics of how the leaper achieves this range are not fully explained in the law, but certain observations constrain the possibilities. The machine is large and presumably heavy. Covering the distances reported in raider accounts requires either very high launch velocity, significant time in the air, or both. Raiders who have observed leaps and survived to describe them note both components. The launch appears extremely powerful, with the machine rising to significant height before beginning its descent, and the arc of the leap covers more horizontal distance than the height would suggest by normal ballistic physics. This observation, the leap covering more horizontal ground than its height would predict under standard physics, is one of the more technically interesting details in the law. It suggests either that the leap involves some propulsive element beyond the initial launch, or that the machine's weight and velocity are genuinely as extreme as the effect implies. The precision of the leaper's targeting during a leap is something that raiders have documented with particular care because it determines what evasion approaches are possible. The machine is not always aiming at your current position when it launches. As noted in an earlier chapter, it appears to account for basic movement in its trajectory. The question that raider tacticians have worked to answer is how sophisticated this accounting is. Specifically, what kinds of evasive movement the machine can reliably compensate for, and what kinds it cannot. The available evidence suggests that simple linear movement is accounted for, moving straight left or right from the launch prediction. Complex or abrupt directional changes, particularly those executed very close to the moment of launch, have a better record of causing misses or partial misses. This finding has influenced evasion doctrine in communities with good leaper knowledge, leading to training emphasis on reading the pre-leap tell and executing the evasion at maximum speed in a non-linear direction. The impact of a leaper landing from a full leap is physically significant and documented in enough accounts to be treated as a reliable effect. The ground impact creates a shockwave that affects raiders within a certain proximity to the landing point, as described in earlier chapters. But the post-landing behavior of the machine is equally important from a tactical standpoint. The leaper's recovery from a full leap is rapid, faster than the impact might suggest. There is a very brief window of potential vulnerability as the machine's legs absorb the landing, but this window is narrow enough that raiders who have tried to exploit it in real encounters report that it rarely works as planned. The machine is back to full combat effectiveness within what feels like a single heartbeat after landing. This rapid recovery is itself a piece of evidence about the engineering quality of the leaper's leg systems. They are not just capable of generating the leap, they are capable of managing the return with equal efficiency. The effect of terrain on leap range and trajectory is one of the more nuanced elements of the leaper's behavior in the law. Elevated launch positions allow for greater range by extending the time in the air for the same launch velocity. Raiders who have learned to track the leaper's position in three-dimensional space, including its vertical position when the terrain allows, note that a leaper that has moved to a slightly elevated position is functionally more dangerous in terms of leap range than one on flat ground. This vertical dimension of leaper threat assessment is something that new raiders consistently underweight and experienced raiders consistently monitor. The machine's ability to use terrain elevation to extend its effective strike range adds a layer to the positional calculus that is not immediately obvious from basic encounter descriptions. There is an interesting question in the law about what happens to objects and raiders that are in the immediate flight path of a leaper in mid-leap. The machine presumably has some capacity to adjust its flight path slightly in response to obstacles or evasion, but it is not infinitely maneuverable once launched. Raiders who have created solid obstacles between themselves and the leaper at the moment of launch have sometimes reported that the machine went around or over the obstacle rather than through it, which would suggest some course adjustment capability in flight. Others report that the machine crashed through light obstacles rather than adjusting, which would suggest that for less substantial barriers, momentum overrides obstacle avoidance. The truth is probably that both occur depending on the specifics of the obstacle, and that the machine applies a real-time calculation of whether to adjust or commit. Both outcomes are dangerous for different reasons. The psychological experience of being on the receiving end of a leaper leap is described in survivor accounts with a consistency that speaks to something genuine about the nature of the experience. There is a phase of recognition where you see the pre-leap posture and know what is coming. There is a phase of decision, too short to be comfortable, where you process your options and choose an evasive response. And then there is the leap itself, which raiders describe as happening in a way that the brain processes differently from other combat events, with a quality of simultaneity, of the machine being far away and then not far away in a way that feels almost impossible, despite being very possible. This perceptual quality of the leap is part of why it is so hard to respond to effectively, even when you have prior knowledge of it. The brain's distance estimation systems are calibrated for normal speeds, and the leaper's leap exceeds those calibrations in a way that creates genuine perceptual confusion. The velocity of the leaper during its leap also means that the physical impact on landing or on contact with a target is extremely high. Raiders who have been struck by a leaper in the act of leaping, as opposed to being damaged by the landing shockwave or a follow-up pulse, describe the experience in terms that convey extreme force. The machine's weight multiplied by its velocity at the peak of its descent creates an impact magnitude that is essentially immediately fatal at direct contact. Raiders who survive proximity to a landing leaper do so through incomplete contact or through significant evasion that reduces their exposure to glancing rather than full impact. The law is unambiguous on this point. A direct leaper-leap strike is not survivable by a raider in normal conditions. The question in a leap encounter is not whether you can survive a direct hit, it is whether you can avoid one. The training implications of everything known about the leaper's leap for raider preparation are substantial and specific. You cannot train general agility and expect it to transfer cleanly to leap evasion. The specific timing, the specific type of movement that works, the specific visual recognition of the pre-leap tell, all of this requires dedicated practice that focuses on the leaper specifically. Having communities that take this seriously, that train specifically for leap evasion as a distinct skill, show measurably better raider survival rates in leaper zones than communities that rely on general combat training. The law reflects this in the accounts of specialist raiders who have trained this way. People whose evasion of leaper leaps is described not as luck, but as trained response, executed under extreme time pressure. The way the leap interacts with the terrain features of leaper patrol zones is another element that rewards careful study. The most effective leaper zones for the machine are those where raiders have limited options for complex, evasive movement, where terrain either constrains the raider's direction of movement or creates false safety in the form of cover that the leap can reach over or around. Experienced raiders mapping leaper zones specifically identify these terrain features: choke points where leap evasion is particularly difficult, open areas where the leap's full range is unobstructed, cover configurations that seem protective but are within leaper leap range. This mapping knowledge is as tactically valuable as knowing the leaper's behavior directly, because the terrain determines what options are available to you when the encounter occurs. The recorded accounts of the longest observed leaper leaps in raider lore have taken on a legendary quality that extends beyond simple documentation of range. These maximum range leaps are stories unto themselves, encounters where the distance covered defied even experienced raiders' updated expectations, where the margin of survival for the raiders involved was so thin that the account reads more like testimony than tactical report. These extreme leaps matter for practical reasons. They update the community's understanding of what the maximum envelope of the threat actually is. But they also function culturally as reminders that the current model of the leaper's capabilities is always potentially incomplete, that the machine may be capable of more than the current community knowledge accounts for. This epistemic humility about the leap's full envelope is part of the healthy leaper culture in well-functioning raider communities. The question of whether the leaper's leap has any non-combat application is similar to the same question asked about the pulse. A mechanism capable of producing the forces involved in a full-range leaper leap is a substantial energy system. Whether the arc has uses for that energy beyond propulsion, whether the leap mechanism serves secondary functions in the arc's operational systems, is not addressed directly in the law. But it is worth noting that the engineering of the leap system is, by any standard, more sophisticated than pure locomotion requires. A machine that simply needed to move quickly across terrain could accomplish that in simpler ways. The leap is more than transportation. Whether its excess capability serves a purpose beyond the obvious, one is a question worth holding as we continue to interpret the leaper's role in the Ark system. The leap's role in the leaper's overall combat strategy is worth summarizing at this point in the chapter. The leap is a distance-closing tool that negates one of the raider's most natural defensive responses, which is creating and maintaining safe separation from the threat. The pulse prevents close-range safety. The leap prevents distance safety. Together, they define a kill zone that has no truly safe interior from the raider's perspective. The only functional safety from a leaper is outside its operational area entirely, which is exactly the kind of total area denial that a security machine is designed to produce. The leap and the pulse are not two separate attacks that happen to belong to the same machine. They are complementary systems designed together to make the machine impossible to deal with through positioning alone. Chapter 8. Survivor Testimonies and the Oral History of Leaper Encounters. One of the richest veins of lore about the leaper comes from the survivor accounts that circulate in Haven communities, the stories that people who have faced the machine and lived tell to others who need to face it in the future. These accounts are not uniformly reliable. Memory under stress is imperfect. Storytelling introduces distortions over time as accounts are repeated and refined. The desire to make a story coherent and teachable can smooth out the genuine confusion and partial information of the original experience. But these accounts, with all their imperfections, are the primary medium through which leaper knowledge is transmitted in the human communities of Ark Raiders, and they carry a weight of human experience that more technical analysis does not. The structure of a typical leaper survivor account follows a pattern that is recognizable across many such stories in the lore. It begins with the encounter context. Where was the team? What were they after? What did they already know about the leaper presence in the area? It moves to the first sighting, which is almost always described with a specific quality of attention, the moment when the environment registered as containing this particular threat. It proceeds through the events of the encounter itself, usually in more detail than the speed of those events would seem to warrant, a reflection of the way traumatic memory captures certain moments with extraordinary clarity while blurring others completely. And it ends with either the survival itself or the account of how teammates died, which is typically the emotional core of the story. The first sighting descriptions in Leaper survivor accounts are remarkably consistent in their phenomenology. There is something specific about seeing a leaper before it has seen you that appears across multiple independent accounts. The combination of size, movement pattern, and the spatial relationship of the legs in motion creates a visual profile that experienced raiders say is unmistakable, and that new raiders describe learning in a single observation that they never forget. The lore captures this as a kind of perceptual initiation. The first time you see a leaper, you learn something about the visual world that permanently updates your understanding of what the surface contains. After that first sighting, you see it everywhere you go, in the way distant shapes move, in the way certain terrain configurations suggest the presence of something you do not want to find. The accounts of the encounter phase itself reveal the cognitive experience of fighting under leaper conditions in ways that tactical analysis cannot fully capture. Raiders describe the experience as one of compressed time combined with fragmented attention, where the necessity of tracking multiple simultaneous threats means that your awareness is never fully on any single thing. You are aware of the leaper, but not only the leaper. You are aware of the companion units, but not only them. You are aware of your team's positions, but cannot give them full attention. The leaper encounter forces a kind of divided awareness that is cognitively exhausting and practically dangerous, because any of the things you are not fully attending to can kill you at any moment. The lore captures this cognitive experience in the accounts of survivors who describe the encounter not just as physically dangerous, but as mentally overwhelming in a specific and distinctive way. The accounts of successful leaper kills in survivor testimony are among the most detailed and carefully rendered of the leaper stories in community lore. They are studies in precision, accounts of what worked, exactly, and why, because the people telling them understand that this information has survival value for their listeners. But they also carry a specific quality of hard-won satisfaction that comes through even in transmission, the sense that defeating the leaper represents an accomplishment that has real weight in this world. The accounts tend to emphasize the team coordination required, the specific timing of attacks relative to pulse cycles, the way the terrain was used, the roles that individual team members played. They are not stories of individual heroism, so much as accounts of a team solving a very difficult problem under extreme pressure. The accounts of Leaper encounters that went wrong, where raiders died or teams were forced to run, carry a different quality. They tend to be more honest about the confusion and the fear, more willing to acknowledge the moments when the team's plan broke down and they were simply reacting. They often contain an element of self-examination, a returning to the question of what could have been done differently, which is itself a form of community knowledge generation. The community learns not just from successes, but from the carefully examined failures, from the accounts of what the Leaper did that was not anticipated, what the team's response was, and why that response was insufficient. These failure accounts are some of the most valuable pieces of Leaper lore precisely because they represent situations where the machine was better than the humans facing it. There are specific Leaper encounters in the oral history of raider communities that have achieved enough recurrence and cultural weight to function as foundational stories. These are accounts that almost everyone in a given Haven community knows, that new raiders are told early in their preparation, that experienced raiders reference as touchstones when discussing Leaper doctrine. The content of these foundational stories varies by community, but certain structural features are consistent. They involve a Leaper doing something unexpected. They involve a raider or team making a mistake that illuminates a principle about Leaper encounters. And they end in a way that is unambiguous about the consequences of that mistake. These stories are designed to be memorable and instructive simultaneously. The transmission of these foundational accounts across communities is one of the mechanisms by which Leaper knowledge spreads beyond individual Haven groups. Raiders who travel between communities or who have come from other communities carry their own foundational stories and encounter them in different forms in new communities. The comparison of different communities' foundational Leaper stories is itself a form of knowledge synthesis, revealing what different communities have emphasized, what they have learned, and what gaps remain in the aggregate community understanding. This cross-community transmission is imperfect and inconsistent, but it is one of the primary ways that the broader raider culture's collective understanding of the Leaper has been built over time. The role of women and younger raiders in Leaper encounter history is something that the lore treats without particular emphasis, but without exclusion. The arc does not discriminate in its targets, and raiders of all backgrounds have faced the Leaper with outcomes that reflect capability and knowledge rather than demographic factors. Some of the most frequently cited Leaper specialists in community lore are women. Some of the most detailed and useful encounter accounts come from younger raiders who applied fresh analysis to encounters that older raiders had perhaps become too habituated to see clearly. The Leaper is an equalizer in the most brutal sense. It kills whoever it catches, and it can be learned by whoever is willing to do the work. The emotional dimension of long-term Leaper exposure in experienced raiders is something the lore captures in accounts that span career-length timeframes rather than individual encounters. Raiders who have spent years operating in Leaper zones describe a specific kind of relationship with the threat that develops over that time. It is not exactly acceptance, and it is not exactly habituation. It is something more like coexistence, the development of a steady state of awareness and readiness that does not spike to crisis level with every encounter, but never drops below a baseline of genuine wariness. These long-term raiders describe the Leaper as something they have made peace with, in a practical rather than emotional sense. They have accepted that it is there, that it will continue to be there, that dealing with it is part of what they do, and that getting better at dealing with it is a meaningful ongoing project. That acceptance is not comfort, but it is survivable in a way that either the early terror or the dangerous complacency that sometimes follows it are not. The accounts in the lore of raiders who have encountered the same Leaper multiple times in the same patrol zone over multiple runs are particularly interesting because they represent something close to a longitudinal relationship between a specific human and a specific machine. Whether the Leaper has any recognition of these repeat encounters from its side is unknowable. From the Raiders' side, the accounts describe a progression from general threat assessment to something much more specific, a detailed mental model of that specific machine's tendencies, positions, and timing that is far more precise than general Leaper knowledge. These individual machine-specific knowledge accounts are the most granular Leaper lore available, and they paint a picture of a machine whose behavior is patterned enough to be studied at the individual level, even if those patterns operate within a range of variability that never allows for complete certainty. The death of a Leaper, from the perspective of the Radar accounts that describe it, is not described with celebration or triumph. It is described with a specific kind of respect and acknowledgement of the significance of what was accomplished. There are no accounts of raiders casually dismissing a Leaper kill. The language in these accounts, even when filtered through the cultural norms of communities that value practical toughness over open emotional expression, consistently reflects an understanding that defeating the Leaper was meaningful. Some of this is the natural response to surviving a serious threat, but some of it seems to be a specific respect for the machine itself, an acknowledgement of its design quality and operational effectiveness that extends beyond simple relief at surviving it. The way survivor testimonies have shaped community doctrine is one of the most important mechanisms in the lore for understanding how raider communities develop their collective knowledge. The accounts are not just cultural artifacts, they feed directly into training approaches, route planning, resource allocation, and the development of community-level tactical doctrine around Leaper zones. A particularly influential account that changes the community's understanding of a specific Leaper behavior can ripple outward into changed training emphasis, changed equipment recommendations, and changed approach protocols for entire seasons of surface operations. The survivor testimony is the primary knowledge generation mechanism for a community that does not have the resources or the time for anything more systematic. The limitations of survivor testimony as a source of Leaper knowledge are acknowledged within the lore itself, usually by the more analytically minded raiders who work to cross-reference multiple accounts and identify inconsistencies. Memory is fallible. Stress distorts perception. Storytelling conventions introduce their own distortions, and the fundamental limit of any survivor account is that it can only describe what the survivor could observe, which is always partial. The Leaper does things that no surviving raider has been in a position to observe. It does things that survivors observed, but could not accurately perceive under the conditions of the encounter. The aggregate of survivor testimony is the most comprehensive Leaper knowledge available to the community, but it is explicitly acknowledged as incomplete and imperfect, a working model rather than a definitive description. The cross-referencing work done by raider analysts and community knowledge keepers to synthesize the survivor testimony record is some of the most sophisticated intellectual work depicted in the Ark Raiders lore. These individuals take accounts that are individually incomplete and sometimes contradictory and work to identify the consistent patterns beneath the surface variation. They note where multiple independent accounts agree and treat those agreements as relatively reliable observations. They note where accounts diverge and work to identify whether the divergence reflects genuine Leaper behavioral variability or observation error. They flag accounts that seem internally inconsistent or that contradict the aggregate record in ways that cannot be easily explained. This analytical work is the foundation of the formal Leaper knowledge that Haven training programs are built on, and the people who do it are among the most valuable contributors to community survival capability, even though they typically do so from behind a desk rather than on the surface. The relationship between the survivor testimony tradition and the lived experience of going to the surface is a tension that runs through raider culture. The people who know the most about the Leaper from the testimony record are not always the people with the most direct surface experience. The people with the most direct surface experience do not always have the analytical distance to synthesize their observations into reliable general knowledge. The ideal Leaper expert is someone who combines both significant surface time in Leaper zones and the analytical capacity to extract reliable knowledge from their own and others' experiences. These individuals are rare and are prized by their communities accordingly. Their accounts are the closest thing the raider world has to authoritative Leaper knowledge, and even they acknowledge the limits of what they know. The final theme worth drawing out of the survivor testimony record is the persistence of surprise. Even the most experienced Leaper operators, the people who have built their expertise and their reputations on Leaper zone knowledge, describe ongoing encounters where the machine does something they did not expect. The Leaper continues to produce surprises even for those who know it best, whether this reflects genuine variability in individual Leaper units, ongoing evolution of ARC machine behavior, or simply the limits of how well any system of human observation can fully characterize a machine with this level of complexity and operational range is not clear. But the persistence of surprise in the accounts of the best-informed raiders is itself an important piece of lore. It says something about the Leaper that should inform every encounter, no matter how much experience you bring to it. The Leaper is not fully known. It may not be fully knowable, and that epistemic humility is one of the things that keeps the best raiders alive. Chapter 9. What the Leaper tells us about the Ark. Everything we have covered in this video has been building toward a question that the lore raises, but does not definitively answer. What does the existence of the Leaper, as a specific type of machine with specific capabilities deployed in specific ways, tell us about the Ark itself? The Leaper is not just an enemy unit in a video game, it is a piece of evidence about the system it belongs to. Its design choices, its behavioral patterns, its deployment logic, its relationship to other machines, and to the objectives it guards. All of these things are data points about the Ark. And the Ark's nature, what it actually is, and what it is doing on Earth, is the central mystery that the lore of Ark Raiders is built around. Reading the Leaper carefully is one way to make progress on that mystery. The most basic observation about the Leaper as an indicator of Ark nature is that it reflects significant engineering intelligence. The machine was designed, it was not spontaneous. Its specific combination of capabilities was assembled for specific purposes. The precision with which those capabilities complement each other, the way the leap and pulse work together to eliminate safe positioning, the way the machine type combines with companion units to create layered threat structures reflects the work of something that thought about the problem it was solving before it built the solution. This design intelligence, wherever it comes from in the Ark's organizational structure, is important. The Ark is not a mindless destructive force. It is a system capable of sophisticated problem formulation and engineering response. The specific problem that the Leaper was designed to solve, keeping humans away from Ark operational sites, tells us that the Ark has operational sites worth protecting and that it anticipated encountering human interference with those sites. Both of these implications deserve attention. The existence of sites worth protecting confirms the interpretation of the Ark as something more than a purely military force. It has objectives, locations, operations that matter to it beyond simple area control. And the anticipation of human interference, baked into the Leaper's design as a specifically human threat countering machine, suggests that the Ark knew humans were a threat before it deployed the Leaper, or at least updated rapidly enough to create a machine with these specific anti-human properties early in the invasion. The question of where the Ark's design intelligence originates is one of the most fundamental in the lore. Three main interpretations are present in the available evidence. The first is that the Ark operates under direction from some central intelligence, a single system or entity that designs machines like the Leaper and directs their deployment. Under this interpretation, the Leaper's existence reflects decisions made by a specific Ark decision maker at a specific point in time. Decisions that could potentially be understood and countered if humanity could understand the decision-making system. The second interpretation is that the Ark is a distributed system with emergent intelligence, that machine designs like the Leaper arise from a collective optimization process rather than from any single design authority. The third is that the Ark designs were fixed before the invasion of Earth and represent the accumulated intelligence of many worlds and many operations, applied to Earth as a pre-designed package rather than a response to Earth-specific conditions. Each of these three interpretive frameworks has different implications for what the Leaper tells us about the Ark. Under the first framework, the Leaper is a designed product of a central intelligence that assessed the threat of human raiders and created an appropriate counter. The machine's anti-human optimization is intentional and directed. Under the second framework, the Leaper emerged from a collective process that was responding to the presence of human raiders as a threat to Ark operations, with the design converging on effective anti-human properties through something like evolutionary pressure within the Ark system. Under the third framework, the Leaper is a pre-designed security machine that was not specifically designed for humans on Earth, but happened to be very effective against them. because of broadly applicable design principles. The available law does not allow a definitive choice between these frameworks, but the Leaper's specific anti-human optimization makes the third framework the least satisfying of the three. The Leaper's relationship to other ARC machine types in the broader machine ecology of ARC raiders is worth examining from the perspective of what it tells us about ARC design philosophy overall. The Leaper is not the only ARC machine. It is not even the most powerful. There are machines in the ARC raiders lore that are larger, more heavily armed, and more difficult to defeat in direct confrontation. The Leaper's specific role within this broader machine ecology is as a security enforcer, not a frontline assault unit, not a heavy weapons platform. The ARC, in other words, has differentiated machine design with different types for different functions. This differentiation implies a system capable of matching resources to problems, deploying the right type of machine for each specific operational need. The Leaper is what the problem of protecting active sites from raider interference requires. Other machine types exist for other problems. This differentiation is itself evidence of a high level of ARC operational sophistication. The ARC's apparent ability to adapt its surface presence in response to raider activity, described in earlier chapters in the context of Leaper deployment escalation, tells us something about the ARC's temporal awareness and operational flexibility. A system that can observe raider success in specific zones and respond by increasing Leaper density in those zones is a system with situation monitoring, logical response capability, and deployment flexibility. This is more organizational sophistication than a simple military machine requires. It is the kind of operational intelligence you would expect from a system managing a complex ongoing operation, where the specific threats to that operation can change over time. The ARC manages the Leaper deployment the way you would manage a security resource in a dynamic threat environment, adjusting based on where the threat is actually manifesting. The specific response of increased Leaper deployment rather than deployment of more destructive machine types when raider activity threatens ARC operational sites is itself revealing the ARC is not trying to destroy raiders, it is trying to deter them. A more destructive response could presumably eliminate raider teams more reliably in direct confrontation. The choice to use a security and deterrence tool rather than a pure destruction tool suggests that the ARC's primary objective is operational continuity, not human elimination. The Leaper serves that objective by deterring entry into protected zones. The fact that this is the primary response to raider interference is a significant indicator of the ARC's priorities. The question of what the ARC's long-term plan for Earth is something that every piece of lore in ARC Raiders is ultimately in conversation with. The Leaper, as a piece of that lore, contributes to the picture in its specific way. It tells us that the ARC has ongoing operations. It tells us that those operations have specific locations that matter. It tells us that the ARC has the capability to assess threats and deploy appropriate security responses. It tells us that the ARC prioritizes operational continuity over human elimination, and it tells us that the machines deployed for these security functions are sophisticated enough to counter specifically human adversarial behavior. None of this tells us definitively what the ARC is doing, but it tells us something about what kind of entity is doing it, and that something is the foundation for any serious attempt to understand the bigger picture. The Leaper, in the broader context of ARC Raiders lore, is ultimately a threshold. It marks the line between the surface as a general danger zone and the surface as the location of something that matters. Getting past a Leaper, either by avoiding it or by defeating it, is what accessing the most important parts of the surface requires. In that role, it is not just a game challenge. It is a narrative symbol for what it means to push past the limits of what is safe in pursuit of what is necessary. The raiders who do it are not just skilled players or skilled characters in the fiction. They are the people who have decided that the risk is worth the reward, that whatever lies beyond the Leaper's patrol range is worth what it costs to get there. That decision, made again and again by different raiders in different conditions, for different reasons, is at the heart of what ARC Raiders is about. The ARC itself remains mysterious after everything we have examined. The Leaper does not resolve the mystery, but it deepens it in useful ways. A mystery that produces a machine this sophisticated, this specifically adapted to its function, this precisely integrated into a deployment system, this operationally coherent, is a mystery with a genuine intelligence behind it. Whatever the ARC is, It is not simple. Whatever it is doing on Earth, it is not random. The leaper is one of the clearest pieces we have. The law around the leaper, taken in its entirety, tells a story about a machine that is designed with purpose, deployed with logic, feared with reason, and understood imperfectly by the people who must deal with it. The gaps in that understanding are not failures of the law, they are features of a world that the game's creators have built with genuine intelligence. A world where the most important questions do not have easy answers, and where the most dangerous things are dangerous, precisely because they cannot be fully known. The leaper sits at the center of that design philosophy. It is the machine that best embodies what the Ark is: powerful, purposeful, and not quite comprehensible to the people who survive it. The runs into leaper zones continue. The raiders who make those runs carry everything their communities have learned about the machine, knowing it is not enough, knowing that the machine will surprise them, knowing that the outcome is never certain. They go anyway, because the things the leaper guards are the things the surface still has that humanity needs. That relationship between the machine that guards and the humans who refuse to be deterred is the beating heart of the Ark Raiders narrative. Chapter 10: Patterns in the Ruins. How the leaper shapes raider route planning. Every raider who has spent serious time on the surface has a map. Not necessarily a physical one, though some communities produce those and distribute them carefully. More often the map is mental, built over time from personal experience and absorbed community knowledge, a constantly updated model of the surface that accounts for Ark machine presence, terrain features, resource locations, and the various risks that intersect and overlap across the play space. The leaper occupies a specific and disproportionately large portion of that mental map. Its known patrol zones are marked in a way that other threats are not just as locations to avoid or approach carefully, but as organizing features of the entire route planning process. The leaper does not just affect what you do when you encounter it, it affects where you go before the encounter happens, how you get there, and what alternatives you have prepared in case your primary route becomes compromised. Route planning in Ark Raiders, as documented in community law, is a multi-stage process that begins well before a raider team reaches the surface. It starts with objective identification, what the team is going after, and why. It moves to a survey of the known Ark presence in the area between the insertion point and the objective, which includes everything from patrol unit density to known leaper zones, and it culminates in the selection of an approach route that balances time, exposure, resource requirements, and the specific risks presented by each section of the path. The leaper exerts influence at every stage of this process. Objectives in leaper zones are assessed differently. Routes through or near leaper patrol areas require different planning logic. The alternative routes prepared for contingency situations in leaper areas require more detailed preparation than alternatives in other areas, because the consequences of being forced into an unplanned route in a leaper zone are significantly worse than in lower threat environments. The specific influence of leaper patrol zone boundaries on route selection is one of the more interesting tactical details in the law, because it reveals how much the machine's presence reshapes the raider's effective map of the surface. A route that would be optimal in terms of distance and time may pass through a leaper patrol zone, making it suboptimal in terms of risk. Raiders consistently choose longer, less efficient routes that avoid leaper zones over shorter routes that pass through them, unless the objective itself is in a leaper zone and avoidance is impossible. This consistent choice, documented across multiple raider accounts and tactical discussions in the law, quantifies the leaper's influence. The machine is worth a significant detour in distance and time to avoid. That detour cost, accepted almost universally by raiders who have options, is a direct measure of the machine's deterrent effectiveness. The calculation changes when the objective is in the leaper zone, as it frequently is given the correlation between leaper presence and high-value targets. In these cases, the question is not whether to enter the leaper zone, but how to do it most safely. The route planning for leaper zone entry is governed by a set of principles that the law documents with consistency across different community traditions. Entry points should be from directions that offer maximum leaper detection range, so that the raider team knows where the leaper is before committing to the approach. Approaches should avoid the leaper's primary patrol path where possible, aiming to cross into the target area during a window when the leaper is at the far end of its patrol route. Exit routes should be planned to diverge from the approach routes, both to avoid retracing a path that may have become compromised and to complicate any leaper tracking of the team's movement. These principles are not universally applicable in every terrain configuration, but they form the baseline that most leaper zone route planning starts from. The temporal dimension of route planning in leaper zones is something that the law treats as fundamental rather than optional. The leaper's patrol timing is not perfectly predictable, but it has tendencies that experienced raiders exploit. Knowing approximately how long it takes the leaper to complete a patrol circuit, knowing which portions of that circuit bring it closest to the objective, and which portions create maximum separation, and timing the approach to coincide with the maximum separation phase. These are the core temporal calculations of leaper zone entry. The difficulty is that these calculations require observation data, specifically data about the timing of a particular leaper's patrol in a particular zone that may not be available or current when a team is planning a run. Stale patrol timing data is arguably worse than no data because it creates false confidence. The law reflects this through accounts of teams that base their timing on outdated information and found the leaper where they did not expect it. The role of a designated leaper tracker in raider team compositions is documented in the law as one of the most important tactical positions in teams that specialize in leaper zone operations. This individual's primary responsibility during the operation is continuous monitoring of the leaper's position and movement, communicating updates to the team with enough frequency to allow real-time route adjustments. The cognitive load of this role is substantial. The tracker must simultaneously maintain awareness of their own position and safety, communicate clearly with the team under conditions that may make communication difficult, and continuously update their model of the leaper's likely position from available sensory information that may be incomplete. Teams with a dedicated, capable leaper tracker operating in this role show consistently better outcomes in leaper zone operations than teams without one, which is why the role exists and why it is valued. The specific types of terrain features that raiders seek out or avoid in leaper zones during route planning are codified enough in the law to be considered established tactical knowledge. Natural barriers that limit the leaper's approach angles are valuable. Features that constrain the directions from which a leaper can arrive and allow the team to focus their monitoring in fewer directions. Elevated positions that provide observation of the leaper's patrol area without requiring entry into it are extremely valuable for timing the approach. Narrow corridors that a leaper cannot easily navigate without announcing its approach are situationally useful, though the same corridors that limit the leaper's movement also limit raider escape routes if the encounter goes wrong. The tactical value of any given terrain feature is always relative to the specific situation, and the law reflects the constant tension between features that create advantage in detection and features that create advantage in escape. The mental models that experienced raiders develop for leaper zone navigation are described in law accounts with a specificity that reveals how thoroughly these individuals have internalized the spatial logic of operating around the machine. They describe maintaining an ongoing awareness of what the law terms the leaper's threat envelope, the three-dimensional zone within which the machine can affect them either through the leap or the pulse. This envelope is not static. It moves with the leaper, and it shifts in shape depending on terrain. Maintaining awareness of where this envelope is and keeping the team as close to its boundary as the objective requires, and no closer, is the fundamental spatial discipline of leaper zone navigation. Teams that maintain this discipline consistently outperform those that do not, which makes teaching it one of the priorities of any serious leaper zone preparation program. The effect of multiple raiders operating simultaneously in a leaper zone creates additional route planning complexity that the law addresses through accounts of team coordination challenges. Individual raiders can make independent positioning decisions quickly. Teams have to coordinate those decisions, which takes time and communication that both create noise and can be disrupted by the stress of the situation. The route planning for a team in a leaper zone has to account for how multiple people moving through the space will interact with each other's movement patterns, and how a leaper encounter will affect everyone's position simultaneously. Split team decisions in a leaper zone, where part of the team is caught while the rest is not yet committed to the engagement, are among the most difficult tactical situations in the law to manage successfully. The law is full of accounts of runs that were lost, not because anyone made an individually bad decision, but because the team's collective movement in a leaper zone created a situation that no individual decision could recover from. The planning for extraction from a leaper zone, meaning the route out after the objective has been achieved, is as important as the planning for the approach, and is sometimes treated as more important in the law. The reason for this asymmetry is that extraction is conducted under conditions that may be significantly worse than approach conditions. The team has expended resources. They may have triggered arc alerts during the operation. The leaper may have been disturbed and may be operating in a heightened state. They are carrying extraction goods that may limit their mobility, and they are under time pressure to get back to the insertion point before other complications develop. Raider doctrine that emphasizes always having your exit before you commit your entry is a consistent theme in leaper zone operational planning. And the accounts of runs where this principle was violated tend to describe consequences that make the principle very easy to remember after the fact. The relationship between leaper zone route planning and weather conditions, environmental visibility, and other surface factors is not something the law addresses in great detail, but what it does address is significant. Environmental conditions that reduce visibility affect the raider's ability to detect the leaper at range, which is one of the critical inputs to successful zone navigation. Conditions that create noise on the surface potentially mask the leaper's approach sounds that experienced raiders use as additional input for positional awareness. Conditions that restrict movement, debris, unstable terrain, water or flooding in some areas, limit the route options available to the team, and may force them into paths that increase leaper exposure. The best leaper zone operators account for environmental conditions as a variable in their planning and adjust their route logic accordingly, not just optimizing for the average case, but accounting for how their options change if conditions are worse than expected. The competitive dimension of leaper zone route planning within the broader ARC Raiders context is something that the law captures through accounts of multiple raider teams operating in the same high-value zone simultaneously. When two or more teams are in a leaper patrol area at the same time, the dynamics become significantly more complex. One team's engagement with the leaper can alter the patrol pattern that another team was counting on. One team's movement can push the leaper toward another team's position. One team's noise signature can trigger arc response that affects the conditions for everyone in the zone. These multi-team leaper zone encounters are described in the law as some of the most chaotic and least survivable situations on the surface, because the careful individual planning that each team brought to the operation becomes worthless the moment another team's actions change the situation faster than either team can adapt. The law around leaper zone navigation contains an interesting category of accounts that might be called near-miss testimonies. Stories about runs that almost went catastrophically wrong in the leaper zone, but somehow did not. These accounts are not straightforward survival stories because the team survived without defeating the leaper or even engaging it. They are stories of narrow escapes through timing, terrain use, creative improvisation, or simple fortune. These near-miss accounts are culturally significant because they preserve information about situations that the team was not prepared for and managed through adaptation rather than planning. The improvised solutions that worked in these near misses sometimes become formalized into route planning doctrine because they reveal capabilities or terrain features or timing opportunities that standard planning approaches had not previously accounted for. The long-term evolution of leaper zone route planning approaches across the timeline of the ARC Raiders world is reflected in the law through the contrast between early accounts and later ones. Early raider accounts of leaper zone operations are characterized by improvisation, high casualty rates, and a primitive understanding of the spatial logic required for survival. Later accounts show increasingly sophisticated planning approaches, detailed pre-mission route work, defined team roles, contingency planning for specific failure scenarios, and a much clearer understanding of the principles that govern safe movement in leaper zones. The evolution is not linear. There are accounts of teams that developed brilliant tactical innovations, followed by accounts of communities that lost that knowledge when the people who held it died. But the general trajectory is toward greater sophistication, bought at an ongoing price in lives and runs lost. The specialist knowledge of specific leaper patrol territories, meaning detailed knowledge of specific leapers in specific zones, rather than general Leaper knowledge, is described in the law as among the most valuable information a raider community can possess. General Leaper knowledge tells you how the machine type behaves. Specific territorial knowledge tells you how this particular machine behaves in this particular space, which is a much more actionable foundation for route planning. The development of this specific knowledge requires sustained access to observation opportunities in the zone, which means sending observers who are willing to risk Leaper exposure specifically for the purpose of gathering data rather than extraction. This investment in observation is not undertaken lightly, but communities that make it develop a route planning capability for their home Leaper zones that is qualitatively superior to what can be achieved without it. The psychological preparation for route planning in Leaper zones involves a specific discipline that the law describes as detachment, the ability to plan a route through a Leaper zone as a problem-solving exercise without the anticipatory fear of the encounter contaminating the quality of the planning. Raiders who plan from fear tend to overweight avoidance and underweight efficiency, choosing routes that feel safer, but that may actually expose the team to greater risk through extended surface time or suboptimal approach angles. Raiders who have developed the capacity to plan the Leaper zone route with analytical clarity, holding the fear aside during the planning phase to be deployed appropriately during the execution phase, consistently develop better routes and execute them more successfully. This psychological discipline is described in the law as one of the harder skills to teach, because it requires a relationship with fear that is neither suppression nor indulgence, but active management, and not everyone has the psychological architecture to develop it. Chapter 11. When Things Go Wrong. Leaper Encounters That Changed Everything. There are moments in the history of raider communities that become dividing lines. Before and after certain encounters with the Leaper, certain runs that went catastrophically wrong or unexpectedly right, communities changed how they operated, what they believed was possible, and what they were willing to attempt. These foundational encounters are not always the ones where the most people died or where the most valuable extraction was achieved. They are the ones where something about the Leaper revealed itself that permanently updated the community's understanding of the machine. The law contains several such moments, documented with varying levels of detail, and they are worth examining both for what they reveal about the Leaper specifically and for what they tell us about how human communities learn under the extreme conditions of the Ark invasion. The encounter that the law suggests was among the most significant in terms of its effect on early raider doctrine around the Leaper involved a team that was operating under the assumption that the machine's primary threat was the leap, which at that stage of community knowledge was the better documented capability. The team had developed an approach that prioritized maintaining distance to stay outside estimated leap range, using ranged engagement to chip away at the machine from what they believed was a safe zone. The pulse, either not yet documented in reliable community knowledge or not adequately transmitted to this team, was the thing they were not prepared for. The account of this encounter, reconstructed from the one survivor who made it back, is one of the clearest examples in the law of how a single information gap can turn an otherwise competent and prepared team into a casualty. The team did not make stupid mistakes. They made informed decisions based on their best available knowledge. Their best available knowledge was incomplete, and the Leaper did not care about that distinction. The aftermath of encounters like this one, where teams operated carefully and competently and still suffered severe consequences, is where the most interesting law about community response and knowledge generation lives. These encounters create a specific kind of crisis in raider communities, not the crisis of facing an enemy that is simply stronger, but the crisis of facing an enemy that is revealing new things about itself that your best current knowledge did not predict. The response to this kind of crisis is the most important knowledge generation moment because it forces the community to update not just their information about the Leaper, but their confidence in their information, to recalibrate how much certainty is warranted by how much evidence. Communities that respond well to these revelation encounters become better at the ongoing process of knowledge generation about the Leaper. Communities that respond poorly, that dismiss anomalous encounters as bad luck or exceptional circumstances rather than genuine new data, pay for that dismissiveness with future runs. The encounters that revealed the Leaper's behavior in multi-unit formations, specifically the tactical interplay between the Leaper and its companion units that was described in earlier chapters, are documented in the lore as having been genuinely surprising to early raider teams. Before these encounters, the assumption was that different Ark machine types could be treated as separate threats that happened to occupy the same space. The discovery that the Leaper companion unit combination functioned as something more than the sum of its parts, that the companion unit's behavior was actually more dangerous in the presence of a Leaper because of how it constrained raider movement relative to the larger machine, was the kind of insight that changed how teams thought about every multi-unit encounter on the surface, not just Leaper encounters. Some of the most significant revelation encounters in the lore are not dramatic battlefield moments, but quiet analytical discoveries made after the fact. A raider researcher with access to multiple survivor accounts from different teams who operated in the same Leaper zone over a short period notices a pattern in the Leaper's behavior that no single account would reveal. A team that specifically went out to observe a Leaper zone without extracting, purely to gather patrol timing data, comes back with measurements that change the community's understanding of the patrol cycle. A raider who survived a Leaper pulse at an extreme range and analyzed their equipment damage discovers something about the pulse's propagation that was not previously understood. These quieter discoveries are as important to the cumulative knowledge base as the dramatic field encounters, and the lore honors both categories. The encounters where raider teams successfully defeated Leapers in circumstances that the community had previously considered impossible or inadvisable are another category of community-changing events. These are the moments when the boundaries of what is attempted expand, when the community updates its model of what can be done from what had previously been done to what might now be possible. A team that defeats a Leaper in a situation where the conventional wisdom said to run creates a proof of concept that others can build on. The technique they used, the specific sequence of decisions that led to the kill, becomes part of the community's tactical repertoire. These encounters are documented with particular care in the lore because they are generative. They do not just tell you what happened once, they tell you what is possible in general. The failure modes of Leaper engagements that go wrong are documented in the lore, with a taxonomy that reflects how carefully the community has studied these events. Some failures are execution failures, where the team had the right plan but could not execute it cleanly under the stress of the encounter. Some are planning failures, where the plan itself was inadequate given the actual conditions. Some are information failures, where the team's knowledge of the Leaper or the terrain or the objective situation was wrong in ways that could not have been identified in advance. And some are simply bad fortune, where conditions combined in ways that no reasonable planning or execution could have anticipated or countered.